Takahashi Shoichiro rushed onto the road, and in the very moment pushed his younger colleague out from under the wheels of a truck. A terrible impact ended the life of a man who never even suspected a tendency for self-sacrifice. Panic screams and pleas of "hold on" melted into the night sky. He regained consciousness in the spiritual dimension, and an invisible voice read his dossier from the Enma Encyclopedia. His life was quite ordinary, but the finale, heroic. The space flashed, and the essence extended to him a new life. Special talents in exchange for helping her world. She introduced herself as Lucia, the ruler of this dimension, once revered as the goddess of creation. Takahashi answered bluntly. He cannot guarantee that he will meet all expectations, but he is ready to try. The goddess smiled softly, kindly. Everything around was engulfed in darkness, and the boy finally realized he was truly dead. Deafening silence. Only lonely emptiness remained. From the darkness, the contours of a sleeping youth's face slowly emerged. His body suddenly broke free and was carried into a weightless abyss. "Older brother!" A ringing girlish voice instantly tore him from the darkness. Somewhere on the other side, pale hands, as if in despair, reached through the void. The silhouette melted, scattered into crystals of light, intended for the younger sister, but he never managed to give it to her. And suddenly the ringing voice of the sister, calling her brother, tore through the bitter sorrow. Darkness shuddered and swayed. The last sparks barely flickered and then went out. Consciousness abruptly broke free from oblivion. One more moment, and everything changed. The heavy sleep finally receded. The dazzling sun struck his eyes. Ellie hovered above him and loudly demanded that he finally wake up. He lazily sat on the grass, confusedly mumbling a morning hello. While they were heading together to the estate, 10 years had already passed since he was reborn in this world. Returning home with his sister, he reminded himself again of his new status, the eldest son of Baron Proudlord, ruler of the Eliz region. His lands could not boast wealth, so the boy did not stay long and headed out again. Now he was called Rainford Proudlord. Saying goodbye to his family, he went into the forest and finally fully realized he was truly reborn in a world of medieval fantasy. The trees quickly hid him from strangers' eyes. The Baron's domain was surrounded on all sides by wasteland, and the western part was covered by the Silver Forest, a territory where monsters lurk. Reinford accelerated, made a powerful leap, and flew high up the trunk. He easily and skillfully maneuvered between the branches, maintaining his pace. Softly landing, the boy felt his body rapidly strengthen, a bit of talent granted by the goddess. Focusing, he imagined the natural cycle and gathered a water sphere in his palms. He just waved his hands, and a magical rain poured abundantly over the grass. To hold back the flow, Reinford decided to build a barrier of heat-resistant bricks, combining the elements of earth and fire on the go. But he miscalculated a bit. The streams of water hit him directly, and the boy irritably blurted out a bad word. Water splashed in different directions, spreading across the entire field, and he, even more irritated, cursed loudly. The boy froze, stunned, his eyes wide open. With a crash, the massive stone wall in front of him shattered into pieces. He sighed heavily. Controlling such power is quite a challenge. The mana suddenly ran out, and he weakly sank to one knee. Due to a sharp dizziness, he had to squint painfully. Glancing at his own palm, the boy recalled his childhood. Back then, after such spells, he would immediately faint. Suddenly something cracked behind, making him sharply turn around. He carefully sat down on the ground among the bushes, trying to compose himself and restore his breathing. Suddenly, the forest trembled from a wild, terrifying roar. He calmly stretched his fingers, rejoicing. His magical reserve had noticeably increased. His hand confidently clenched into a fist. The strength had fully returned. Sneaking toward the sound, he peeked out from behind a thick trunk. On the ground lay a strange beast, resembling a wolf, growling warningly. Forgetting about fear, the boy ran out of the shelter and anxiously asked if it was intact. The small, fluffy animal whimpered plaintively and cuddled into the young man's hands. A terrible roar shattered the silence. The boy barely managed to press himself against a tree, shielding the little one with his body. Behind him loomed a mountain of muscles, a gigantic horned monster. The creature wildly slammed its fists into the ground, but the youth miraculously managed to jump back. He held his breath in ambush behind the neighboring trunk, while the rescued fluffy creature barked carefreely. Cold sweat broke out on his back. The young man recalled old bestiaries and immediately recognized the snarling orc. He had to fight. He pointed 2 fingers at the monster as if they were a pistol barrel. In his imagination, a metal bullet flashed clearly. The youth decided to create an analog of a firearm, fueling the shot with wind magic. The role of the bullet was to be played by compressed pieces of rock. To surely pierce the monster's thick hide, he heated them to the maximum. In his thoughts, he constructed a spell. The earth fragments had to be compressed like a bullet. The next step was hardening the compressed rock, and then to ignite it with earth magic, bringing the stone to the required density. Magic tore through the darkness. The formation of a stone of ultra-high density began. In a cloud of fragments and sparks, a massive black monolith hung suspended. The boy froze on one knee in the middle of the forest, clutching pulsating energy in his palms. The hand gripped the weapon tighter, and the enemy suddenly lunged forward. A huge muscular bulk charged with all its mass, rapidly closing the distance. The boy did not retreat a step, and gathering all his strength, shouted desperately. Having managed to shout only, "Fire!" he unleashed a devastating volley through the magical rings directly at the attacker. Exhausted, the young man sank heavily under the tree, barely catching his breath from the experienced horror, while the monster's back towered before him. The fallen giant immediately began to collapse forward. With a deafening crash, the heavy carcass smashed face first into the ground just a meter from the boy. Regaining consciousness, he gently stroked the little rescued, fluffy creature and quietly apologized for the pain. Suddenly, his eyes widened. He remembered something important and sharply looked around. Pressing the little animal to his chest, the boy cautiously peeked out from behind the tree. A foreign hand reached out to the animal. Another young man with a calm, cold gaze softly said he would take everything upon himself. The young man exhaled focusedly and decided to take everything upon himself. He fell to his knees before the beaten little one and covered him with healing magic. A glow enveloped the little creature. The young man stubbornly refused to give up until he healed him completely. The puppy blinked in surprise, then joyfully jumped to its feet. It barked loudly and began circling, sincerely making its rescuer laugh. But it was time to retreat. The sky was quickly darkening, and an angry mother was already waiting at home. The young man smiled with relief at the little animal, waved his hand, and ordered it not to get into trouble anymore. After that, he set off. Easily jumping over forest stones, he calmly made his way home. But suddenly, behind him, a quiet whimper sounded. The young man turned around in confusion. The saved, fluffy miracle stubbornly trotted after him. The little animal whimpered plaintively and rubbed against his leg, stubbornly ignoring the pleas to return to its family. The defense broke down. The young man gave up, covering his face with his hand from excessive cuteness, and rushed to pet the puppy. The little creature did not back down a step, so the young man only sighed and yielded to its persistence. The boy gave in. There was no choice left anyway. He reminded the little one of the strict parental rules, although inwardly he was melting at this fluffy face. Lifting the little animal high above his head, he offered to live together, and in the next moment heard joyful barking. Pure fluffiness. The decision was made. It remained only to give the new family member a name. Without much thought, the boy happily named him Shiro. 3 months passed. The boy walked along the path and calmly beckoned the little one to follow him. But when he turned around, he was breathless. Instead of a tiny puppy, a giant fluffy beast stood in that place, and some girl was already hugging it. During this time, Shiro had clearly grown up. 2 boys were making their way through the night forest with a torch, until they reached the point for Mr. Rhine's map. One of them froze in amazement. Right on the ground sparkled a huge magical crystal. Later, the find was delivered to the ancestral estate. Mother and little Ellie admired the fiery stone with delight, not believing that Rain had obtained it in a battle with a mighty orc. The young man nodded modestly, and the girl, running up, threw herself around his neck. She was completely thrilled by her brother's feat. Rhine gently stroked her head, as if melting from that joyful smile. He sincerely considered his younger sister the sweetest creature in the world. The family idyll continued. Suddenly, Mother also rushed to hug, tightly holding both children to herself, while Rain awkwardly muttered. The commotion was interrupted by a man who sneaked up from behind and quietly called Ellie. Miriam Proudlord was once a famous, powerful sorceress, but now she had become gentle, a bit absent-minded, mother who keeps the family afloat. And that man turned out to be Fred, a brilliant butler who perfectly managed the entire household of the estate, and now was quietly shedding tears of pride for his matured master. Rain tensed and froze, while the master of the house thoughtfully examined the giant, magical stone on the table. As it turned out, he worried in vain about the family's reaction. Without unnecessary questions, everyone happily accepted his fluffy beast. Even though Shiro had grown to the size of a real giant, Rain could barely wrap his arms around him. But as soon as this happened, the atmosphere in the office sharply changed. The father hugged Ellie and immediately grew gloomy. It was time to discuss the very orc they had encountered in the forest. The investigative team had already combed the territory, but found no traces of other similar monsters. Almost nothing remained from the battle, only the corpse of the creature and this massive trophy. Rain awkwardly recalled the sudden lake and the strange fortress wall in the thicket, but for him the key evidence was the crystal itself. So far, the boy felt no threat, until the terrible sentence sounded. By the size of the stone, Rain realized he had defeated not an ordinary soldier, but the king of the orcs. Once this high-ranking monster wiped entire regions off the face of the earth, so such a feat would be officially reported to the ruler. Everyone stared in awe at the shining trophy. After all, the magical power hidden inside was simply colossal. Rain thought, such power should be broken into smaller parts and distributed across the domains. But for that, he would have to turn to the blacksmith. The boy raised his palm. Rain sat thoughtfully at the table, in front of the massive magical crystal. The sudden voice of the little one made him shudder. He did not waste time with unnecessary introductions, so he simply asked to be given the stone. Within a minute, Rain obediently dragged the heavy boulder after the boy. The boy mounted the giant wolf, and they set off on the road. Ahead stretched a dead, cracked desert field. Rain asked with doubt whether the man really intended to spend the crystal on this hole. The man explained that all attempts to develop this territory had failed miserably. There was solid rock instead of soil and no water at all. But the boy, without hesitation, said he would bring water here and build an irrigation system. He smiled slyly. The next statement from the boy made Rain blink in confusion. It turned out he intended to build a dam. The gigantic water dam was meant to change this landscape forever. The scale of the plan was simply overwhelming. The father blinked in surprise. What dam? Rain just smiled broadly and said they would have to abandon everything. The young man calmly laid out the mechanics. A dam is a gigantic reservoir that allows accumulating water and releasing it suddenly. He shifted his gaze to the magic stone in his father's hands and asked to borrow it. Grabbing the crystal, the boy rushed forward and shouted to his father to stay away. Rain focused on the artifact lying in his palms. The stone surface suddenly cracked, and unexpectedly water splashed out from the cracks. The father froze. A water vortex enveloped the crystal, and it began changing color right before their eyes, from red to blue. Rain carefully placed the stone on the ground. Looking back, he threw his father a brief warning. Prepare for strong shocks. The boy, with stone-cold calm, voiced the impossible. He had just completely transformed the magical attribute of the stone from fire to water. The father froze in horror, staring at his son. What else, huh? What did he think up there? Meanwhile, a frame from Reina's past life floated before his eyes. An office subordinate whom he once shielded with his own body. The image surged forward, becoming clearer and clearer. The very last moment of his first life, when he covered the subordinate with himself. Dim memories from the past life flashed before his eyes. Parents and younger sister. Standing on the edge of the abyss, the boy recalled that one moment when he first saw death. He slowly raised his hands to the sky. Energy poured through his fingers like a stream of light. The boy sharply directed the magical whirlwind into the ground, holding only one thought in his mind. If he was already reborn, then goodbye, hellish corporations. He burst out laughing sincerely, as if welcoming the new life in which he intended only to eat and sleep. A terrible explosion shattered the rock to pieces, and he firmly decided to live carefree. When the dust settled, a gigantic, perfectly round crater appeared in place of the rocks. Silence reigned again around. The young man stretched out his palms and let the force pass through the stone. From the crater wall, a waterfall burst out with a roar, and the boy only smugly placed his hands on his hips under the stunned gaze of his companion. The rocky rock around the stream compacted securely. A tall man stood nearby. He examined the perfect foundation and immediately estimated. With such water pressure, this huge reservoir would fill in just 2 days. He explained that further channels would be laid out in a regular grid and connected with rivers throughout the territory. According to his calculations, the water would fill everything in about 2 days. It is enough just to open the sluice, and the farmland will immediately have a stable water supply. The father and son silently watched the turbulent stream. Suddenly, the man sharply grabbed the boy by the shoulders and, stunned, asked if he had just cast 2 spells at once. The boy joyfully boasted about the dam that would bring prosperity to their lands, and did not notice his father's stupor at all. With a blank face, he asked where exactly the verbal spell was. A confused silence hung, as if someone had pressed pause. The little one blinked sincerely, completely not understanding which words were being referred to. The father glanced around the gigantic earthen walls and muttered in shock about the scale of this power. The man's eyes suddenly widened from the cold realization. Meanwhile, the son innocently asked what exactly to change the attribute of a magic stone meant. At that moment, the boy still did not know anything. Neither changing the properties of the stone, nor, moreover, gathering double magic, was within the power of any mage in the entire world. The shining goddess Lucia gently promised him moderate magical talent, and the ability to cast several spells simultaneously existed only in ancient myths. Now, hovering high above the island city, he mentally screamed fiercely. What did she mean by moderate? The sky floated before his eyes. The goddess's statement frankly seemed like mockery. He indignantly shouted the name Lucia, completely shocked by his own absurd power. In the distance stretched an endless, dense forest. Malam Rain sat in his father's study and leafed through a book about the 6 magical elements of the world: fire, earth, water, wind, light, and darkness. But he was most struck by light and darkness. Sparks flashed in his head as if someone had touched an invisible fire. They spun like tiny stars in the boundless void. Their light spread farther and farther, like the echo of foreign magic. Tearing himself away from the book, the boy remembered the main rule. Most people have talent for only one element. Those who mastered 3 or 4 were considered undisputed geniuses, and mastery of at least 2 already guaranteed the status of a talented mage. Ryan looked into the shining distance before him and quietly asked himself, is it possible to have talent for all at once? Years ago in the library, a blonde woman joyfully clapped her hands, praising his magic, while a tall official behind them panicked, thinking about how to report this to the king. The man slammed against the cabinet and slid down, dripping with cold sweat. The blonde boy nearby leaned toward Ryan and smiled contentedly, calling his abilities amazing. While those present excitedly stirred conversations about this unheard-of talent, Ryan himself stood stunned, and the official by the wall barely stayed on his feet. Finally, the man simply closed his eyes and sighed. There was no point in worrying about the consequences anymore. The man leaned on the table and resigned himself. This could no longer be hidden from the king. He raised his hand and loudly announced to those present, Ryan's question is temporarily put on pause. The boy tensed up. If he had kept silent about the change in the properties of the magical stones, the Lord would have been immediately accused of treason. Non-verbal magic and the combination of several elements. This is no joke. The Lord thoughtfully rubbed his chin, deciding to simply observe. Rain's talent knew no bounds, and the boy himself only awkwardly sweated under the weight of such loud words about his modest gift. Leaving magic aside, the Lord immediately got down to business. Tomorrow he sets off to the capital with a report on the new dam. The full-flowing river and the inevitable change in the landscape will force a review of taxes, and the man sternly emphasized, this trip can no longer be postponed. Ryan instantly lit up. Next year the harvest will noticeably increase. He barely restrained his joy, already seeing his ideal, relaxed life on the rich lands. Suddenly, the sharp rustle of a dress. Someone leaned over the table and mercilessly shattered his fantasies, instantly bringing the boy back to the conversation. The long-haired warrior gently placed his hands on Ryan's shoulders and asked him for a favor. Soon the young lord was already riding through the streets on his huge, fluffy wolf, Shiro. Passers-by gladly bowed to the boy and his satisfied beast. In Rain's head, the same thing kept spinning. On the outskirts lived the gnome blacksmith they needed. The boy stopped in front of the massive workshop doors. As soon as the dam was finished, their lands would finally get water. He awkwardly leaned against Shiro. Without tools for plowing, this water would be meaningless. In his memories flashed a magnificent knight's sword. the very one that blacksmith Watts once forged on order. The warrior's face during that conversation remained focused, as if he held a thought on the tip of his gaze. Rain then could not contain his admiration for the master's perfect work. With a sharp clang, the man drew his blade. He was the one who sent the boy to negotiate with the reclusive gnome about creating farming equipment. Talks about the master's difficult character suddenly awakened in Rain a memory of a former life. He recalled the same brilliant but eccentric head chef, but the memory faded moment by moment and quickly dissolved. Only one dry fact remained. The blacksmith has golden hands, but his gnomish quirks would require finding an approach. Rainford frowned and began convincing himself that he must endure this for the sake of the dreamed peaceful life. He twitched. The master had just closed the door right in front of his nose, and it smelled unbearably of hangover. Gathering the remnants of courage, the young man decisively knocked on the wood again with his fist. He loudly introduced himself as a messenger from Clayford and addressed blacksmith Watts. In response, the door barely opened under the owner's displeased muttering. The curtains creaked long and drawn out, betraying themselves with an old squeak. A sullen, bearded man appeared on the threshold, and the boy hurried to apologize for the intrusion. Noticing the noble clothes on the guest, the blacksmith grumbled angrily and abruptly. "Hurry inside." Renford froze, pulling a comically mannered smile, and could not properly hide his nervousness. The blacksmith immediately warned not to trip. The floor was cluttered with junk and empty bottles. Slightly trembling, the young man extended the letter with both hands, which contained all the details. Watts sternly loomed over him and ordered to get straight to business. But as soon as they heard the order, the old master immediately furrowed his brows in confusion. He took the paper, while Renford timidly tried to explain. Supposedly, they needed ordinary iron tools for farming. The dwarf blacksmith cut in. "Such parts cannot be made from ordinary iron." The boy instantly caught the hint and aimed at pride, quietly said, "It's a pity that the creator of the outstanding father's sword won't take on such work." The master angrily slammed his fist on the table. He frowned, grimaced, and turned away. The boy sat up straight and simply started waiting. Before them flickered an ingot, an incredibly rare forged iron, and the gnome was still grumbling that he would not take on such nonsense, but his fist was practically trembling. His fingers could not sit still, itching to reach the metal that any blacksmith dreams of taking. Noticing his hesitation, the young man gently asked to see the workshop. The blacksmith gave in and allowed him to enter for literally a minute. The boy stepped over the threshold of the spacious forge. He slowly scanned the room with his eyes. The tools lay in their places, in perfect order. Silence reigned in the workshop, such that one could hear their own breathing. The boy stepped over the threshold. Unlike the mess outside, perfect cleanliness prevailed here. He immediately understood. The master simply burned with the desire to work. Barely noticeable marks on the device. Heavy hammers, piles of prepared coal, and perfectly arranged tongs silently awaited their time. The boy took a confident step inside. The gloomy blacksmith leaned over from behind and grumbled that the local iron was worthless, but it would suffice for simple tools. The edge of the perfectly clean table, an empty stool near the forge. The big guy wearily waved off, complained about lack of motivation, and ordered the boy to go home. In response, the boy silently clenched a lump of raw iron in his palms. Suddenly, powerful whirlwinds of magical energy tore through the air around him, and the blacksmith had to retreat in confusion. The boy squinted and began to recall everything he had ever read about metal purification. An image became clear, a magnificent father's sword. He wanted to forge a copy, right from this unprocessed piece. A sparkling glow spread through the room, as if the day had pierced the darkness. "What the hell are you doing?" shouted the shocked blacksmith, shielding himself from the furious storm with his hand. The boy mentally calculated the process. Melt the iron with the magic of the heart, raise the temperature, and burn out the gas and all impurities with the wind. The air suddenly shuddered sharply. A wild whirlwind of energy burst from the stone, forcing the blacksmith behind to shield himself from the unbearable heat. Magic with a roar bit into the ore. A dazzling flash exploded right in the middle of the workshop. The big guy barely stayed on his feet, covering his face from the powerful wave. A pillar of light and heat broke through the walls of the forge, bursting far out onto the street, tearing the silence with an explosion of flame. The light suddenly began to fade rapidly, as if it had been turned off along with the heat. Only a sparkling haze remained in the air, thin and ghostly, trembling before the eyes. The boy glanced at the perfectly rectangular ingot hanging above his palms and casually asked what the master thought of it. He calmly handed the black bar to the stunned giant. The blacksmith's rough fingers barely trembled and rested on the metal. A tense, muffled silence hung in the air. The master stared at the bar, not believing his own eyes. In his hands was steel of impossible, absolute purity. The young man smiled joyfully and asked if he could now entrust him with this work. Instead of the usual answer, the burly man suddenly dropped to his knees and hit his forehead on the floor, desperately begging to be allowed to forge. The boy was stunned. He sharply recoiled, staring in shock at the giant sprawled before him. The master did not lift his head and continued to beg for the order, while the young man waved him off in fear. The blacksmith was sweating from worry about the metal, while the boy panicked and fussed nearby, persuading Mr. Watts to get up. He grabbed the master's mighty shoulders and, squeezing with all his might, tried to forcibly pull him off the stone floor. The young man could not stand it and demanded that he simply get to work and stand up. And the man finally stopped bowing low. Watts stood up, solemnly struck his chest with his fist, and asked to sign the contract immediately. His stern face broke into a warm, sincere smile. Meanwhile, outside, a cat calmly watched as thick smoke poured from the forge's chimney. Suddenly, the young man became embarrassed. He had just heard a completely unexpected remark. Without waiting for explanations, he laughed nervously, waved his hand, and tried to disappear from sight as quickly as possible. But the blacksmith held him back, explaining that he meant something completely different. Ryan greeted warmly, stating his name, and the mustached blacksmith immediately blossomed with a smile. It was clear he was glad to have a reasonable client. For a moment, everything froze, as if time hung in the air. The young man asked again in shock, not daring to believe his own ears. The master carelessly pointed a finger at the giant pile of ore. He would not start work until Rain personally turned all this iron into steel. The blacksmith good-naturedly squinted while the boy tried to grasp the scale of the disaster. A nervous smile froze on Ryan's face. He really just dreamed of a peaceful life. Outside, a fluffy beast lazily scratched its ear and remarked with irony, their troubles were increasing. The heavy mattock struck the ground with a swing. Work was bustling. Before the father and son stretched an immense wasteland, perfectly cleared from edge to edge. The big guy proudly declared that very soon this dead land would turn into rich farmland. Rain watched the workers in fascination, admitting that he still couldn't believe it. One of the men showed a ripe fruit and promised to start large-scale crop rotation this year. The boy enthusiastically began outlining a 3-year harvest plan, but the father suddenly interrupted him. He laughed good-naturedly and poked a finger at the son's strange pronunciation. Rain involuntarily felt a chill inside from his own minor slip. He surprisingly quickly recalled that the local grains were called differently, so he hastily changed the subject. Now the boy was showering the father with grand plans for developing residential areas for all the future population. He demanded new tools, trade routes, and huge warehouses so relentlessly, as if from a machine gun. The father was sweating from such pressure, feverishly calculating where to find so many tenant farmers for this scale. For now, Rain beamed an innocent smile, but in his thoughts rubbed his hands. His cunning plan for a carefree life behind the strong father's back had just started. Stop! You can't do everything at once. The father couldn't stand it and shouted. Rain habitually looked up at his father from below. Their peaceful conversation was abruptly interrupted by a carriage appearing on the horizon. Inside the coach, a young man in armor was bored. Habitually raising his nose, he looked around arrogantly, and in his thoughts called these lands a provincial whole. The wheels loudly rumbled along the road, cutting through the silence. When the carriage stopped, it became clear. A capital tax inspector had arrived to them. The father grew gloomy. He did not expect guests so early at all. He immediately felt something was wrong. There was a smell of a serious tax increase in the air. While the boy worked hard at the construction site, reports about their development regularly, without any delays, flowed all the way to the capital. The news about new levies stunned both of them. The door opened. The guest was already comfortably settled on the sofa like a host. A sharp movement. As soon as Rain and his father stepped over the threshold, they were scolded for being late. Vincent Greatwall, the Marquis's second son, stood up and raged over the wasted time. With an icy gaze, the aristocrat cut off that his family had firmly held all the kingdom's finances in their fist for many generations. The blonde in armor sprawled on the sofa and abruptly cut off the host's polite greetings. He arrived by direct royal order to inspect and recount the taxes. The long-haired baron put on a friendly smile, but still immediately realized this inspector was extremely dangerous. The guest coldly cut in that all calculations were already ready, because the land maps had been collected in advance. And, without wasting time, I pronounced the verdict. From now on, the Proud Lord House will pay 500 gold coins, and if converted to familiar money, it amounted to a staggering 50 million yen. The young man next to the baron turned pale. The disaster became obvious. The tax soared to the skies for lands that had not yet been properly settled. 500 gold? The inspector locked his fingers and asked in an icy tone if they had any problems with this. The baron panicked. The amount had grown tenfold, and the air seemed to become heavier because of it. The blonde arrogantly quoted the law. The tax is levied on all arable land, and the owners knew this perfectly well. The long-haired man desperately begged to postpone the assessment, at least until the first harvest, calling the inspector's figures mere forecasts. But the guest mercilessly threatened. This land had not yet even seen farming. His eyes narrowed into a predatory, merciless squint. The blonde placed his hand on the sword's hilt and coldly cut off, "This is an order, not a proposal. From now on, any dissent was considered treason." The guest confidently spread his arms and, as if announcing a royal decree, demanded that his decisions be treated as law. It was a true intoxication with power. The boy anxiously awaited how his burly father would react to such impudence, but the warrior only bowed his head submissively. The safety of family and people was more important to him than his own pride. The son smiled warmly. He quickly knelt down, ready to show the guests the full power of the perfect Japanese dogeza. The paternal habit of yielding to a bully became a real lesson for him. Suddenly, a girl with a plush bear and a tray of tea in her hands joyfully entered the room. She was noticeably nervous, yet still tried her best to maintain dignity. The boy froze, as if her efforts had touched his heart. The girl awkwardly curtsied and introduced herself. Elizabeth Proudlord. The happy girl kindly offered the guest a cup of tea. The man in armor sharply waved and struck the hands. The porcelain clinked and flew straight into the teddy bear. He indifferently lowered his palm, while the little girl looked shocked at the spilled puddle. Her eyes filled with tears. The girl whispered how her mother tried and helplessly reached for the toy. She desperately pressed the bear to herself, hiding her face from the offender. Suddenly, the leftover tea splashed right on her, and the little one cried out pitifully. Superciliously, sipping directly from the teapot, the guest asked in an icy tone who had even allowed her to speak. His face twisted with anger. Oppressive shadow fell over everything around. Silence compressed the space like a crush on the chest. And suddenly the knight threw back his head and laughed, hysterically, sharply. With a maniacal grin, he spat out, "That miserable swill, tasteless and colorless, worse than slops." The inspector added that such filth perfectly matched her cheap outfit. The girl sobbed bitterly until an angry local lord burst into the room and yanked the offender by the cloak. He, in turn, only sneered contemptuously. The inspector went wild, not believing that some petty noble dared to contradict him. The young man rushed forward, shielding his frightened younger sister with his own body. The enemy coldly ordered them to be glad that he had not yet cut off their heads with his sword. Someone sharply ordered Rhine to retreat, but the boys saw only the little girl's tears. A sudden attack. A black shadow pierced the air straight into Ray's face amid a frightened scream. Complete shock, a second of tense silence. The youth's eyes flared with rage, and he burst into a scream, cursing the bastard who made his sister cry. Rhine looked gloomily straight ahead. Opposite him stood a tall knight in heavy armor. A drawn-out, tense silence settled. The boy shielded the back of the man holding a little girl. They were fearfully pressed against the door. The inspector angrily jabbed his finger at Rhine, threatening retribution for such insolence. At that very moment, the boy dashed forward, leaving a deep crack in the floor. In despair, the man shouted his name, as if that could stop the trouble. Instinctively, he pressed the child closer to himself, as if protection could become a shield. The man begged the boy to restrain himself and not accidentally injure a government official. At these words, the inspector turned pale and cold sweat slowly rolled down his cheek. The humiliated knight lunged at the scream and declared that he would kill the insolent one, not as an ordinary tax collector, but as an elite royal warrior. He jerked forward, and a massive, icy blade snapped out of his hand. Deadly magic burst forward with a roar. Ryan met the attack with the same impassive, cold gaze. The armored hand jerked sharply, and the ice arrow flew, cutting through the air. Space flared ahead, torn by a massive black strike. The boy's gaze became sharper than a blade. Dark energy slammed into the floor with a roar. A sinister discharge flashed right behind the youth's back. A predatory, ominous smile appeared on the stranger's lips. A lightning-fast lunge, and time seemed to tear away from its place. The boy stubbornly held his ground. He looked around in surprise. The arrow whistled and embedded itself in the wall a millimeter from his head. The enemy roared madly. The figure of the knight was enveloped in a dark aura. He muttered hoarsely that now he was truly enraged. A heavy boot angrily stomped into a puddle amid cries about dirty tricks. The youth only smiled innocently and finished with a question. Wasn't he furious all this time? The knight asked gloomily what was so funny about it, and the youth carelessly apologized. The inspector's eyes flared with rage. Behind the sword's blade, he promised the insolent one death. The insult burned the man from within. Smiling, the boy apologized once more, and the knight clenched the hilt until it cracked. Suddenly, the space around the youth boiled with mana, and he began to summon the ice hell. Dark energy tightly enveloped the blade. The youth leisurely raised the sword to his face and commanded the magic to tear the enemy's throat. The window panes trembled slightly. In the library, the elf girl sharply raised her head. An abnormal surge of power struck her senses like an electric shock. Ice hell, cocytus. The boy shouted the command and sharply tightened the movement as if pulling a trigger. A deafening roar exploded overhead, causing the glass in the frames to tremble. The shock wave burst forward, breaking the silence and sweeping away fine dust and debris in its path. The air split with a whistle, like a blade, and this sound immediately bit into the very heart. The boy spun a destructive whirlwind of magical blades, and from his power, the girls nearby barely managed to drop to the ground. The boy sharply pointed a finger at the stunned knight with a bare sword, shielding the crying girl. Clenching his teeth, the little one flared with a bright aura, preparing to accept the fight. The enraged knight sprang from his place and rushed straight at him. A ringing strike. The youth rushed to meet him and stopped the steel blade dead with an ordinary wooden sword. The attacker's face twisted with tension and rage. The youth looked at him completely calmly, holding the weapon and its weight without any effort. Suddenly, the knight's eyes widened with wild horror. Cold sweat appeared on his forehead, and he helplessly began to retreat. One sharp push, and the armored warrior was thrown all the way onto the sofa. The youth slowly approached the trembling enemy. He had to answer for little Ellie's tears. His confident steps rolled dully through the room. A cold verdict sounded. For this, he will pay in full. But suddenly the hero smiled kindly, and, in the heart of the frightened knight, asked whether he is good at collecting taxes. The wooden blade menacingly froze a centimeter from the enemy's face. A sharp turn, and everything turned upside down. The knight was stunned. The unexpected maneuver threw him off track. He nervously retreated, drenched in sweat. Right in front of his face, a perfectly sharpened blade flashed threateningly. With terrifying calm, the young man mentally noted he could cut them down cleanly. He carelessly hinted at the loss of hands, and from this the opponent trembled with horror. Then, just as casually, he explained that during spells the mage relies mostly on a completely different area, and he, as if joking, poked a finger at the knight's throat, asking if he would prefer the throat as a target instead of the hands. The knight exclaimed embarrassedly, not understanding what it was all about. While they were figuring it out, the young man innocently sat on the ground, barely holding the heavy sword, and asked permission to pose one unusual question. His gaze fixed firmly on the blade. He slowly began to speak about metal brought to the absolute limit of cooling, and, smiling broadly, he peeked out from behind the blade, as if displaying his idea for everyone to see and waiting for a reaction. The smile did not leave his face. Almost in a whisper, he asked if Ryan guessed what exactly he was implying. Rain squinted intently, trying to understand what would happen to this material next. He calmly explained the principle of thermal shock. Heating expands an object, and rapid cooling forces it to contract so much that it becomes destructive. The structure simply cannot withstand that stress. The boy asked what would happen if this object turned out to be a sword. The knight turned pale and broke out in sweat, just listening to the theory about extreme temperature reduction. This is what happens. Rain casually held the blade, which was already sparkling from the sharp change. He barely touched the steel with his finger, and it responded with a metallic crack. At the slightest touch, the sword shattered into pieces, as if it had never existed. With a creepy smile, the boy suggested testing this effect on a living body. Sharp fragments clinked and fell to the ground, cutting the silence with a fine hail. The knight's nerves gave out. Foaming at the mouth, he helplessly collapsed on his back. Rain turned to his shocked companions and met them with an innocent, angelic smile. The fallen opponent remained lying on the floor, unconscious. A luxurious mansion towered in the middle of a dense forest. The man in light armor helplessly sprawled on the floor, and the boy anxiously leaned over him. Somewhere far away, the tree crowns rustled peacefully under the cloudy sky. It was there, among the giant trunks, that a whole forest settlement was hidden, with neat little houses built right on the branches. Opening his eyes, he suddenly sat up in bed and feverishly tried to understand what had happened in the last few minutes. Nearby, completely calmly, stood the proud lord family together with little Rainford. It turned out they hadn't finished him off, and he was still alive. They explained to him in an official tone that he had fainted from exhaustion, delicately glossing over their recent deadly conflict, and the memory of Rainford's terrible aura still echoed through his nerves. Back then, he was honestly preparing to die at the hands of this child. He clenched the blanket until his knuckles turned white and relived his absolute defeat before that power, where his magic was just a toy. And already at dinner, the proud lords unexpectedly surrounded him with such family warmth that he had never seen in his own cold marquee home. An ordinary tomato turned out to be so sweet that his eyes nearly popped out of their sockets, and Rainford joyfully explained this was the result of his water magic. The mind of the 10-year-old boy was terrifying. He sprinkled adult terms and easily manipulated schemes of progressive taxes. And while his old sword disappeared after the battle, the family gave him a new one, forged by the local blacksmith from unprecedentedly pure steel. The metal sparkled like the night sky. Each facet lived with its own shine. Suddenly, a sharp flash pierced everything, so bright that the eyes involuntarily closed. He decided to make the simplest test swing, just checking the balance of the blade. From this single movement, the ground was torn apart by a gigantic crystalline explosion, and he paled, instantly realizing, with such magical weaponry, it is better not to go among people. But he lacked the courage to admit to Rainford that the gift had turned out to be too dangerous. After a whole day of exhausting disputes about the fate of the territories, Vincent pushed aside the tax questions and fell into bed exhausted. Night fell upon the earth. The tree branches barely moved and trembled in the darkness. There was a deep silence. The estate was sound asleep, not making a single sound. In the morning, workers loaded the carriage with boxes of tomatoes, and Ellie, blushing deeply, whispered a wish for Vincent to have a safe journey home. She timidly handed him a picked flower, and the knight, as if caught off guard, blushed confusedly. He was touched by her holy kindness. Despite Vincent's past behavior, she left a lily by his bed, giving him a peaceful sleep. Vincent bowed his head, sincerely apologized for his actions, and warmly thanked Lady Ellie. Looking out the window, he noted in his diary his realization. The past Vincent was dead. From now on, he would start from scratch and serve people like a true knight. Several months passed this way. Sitting on the stairs, the girl pondered success. Years of mastering the wasteland had finally come to an end, and now her father had set off to the capital for a royal reward. Life rolled along its usual path. Every morning, Reina was joyfully greeted by his large, fluffy companion. For the successful mastering of the wasteland, the family was honored, so the father was just invited by the king, who was away. As soon as the guest realized that they were not going to kill him, the tension at the table instantly eased. After waking up, Vincent was already expecting punishment every second. Everything was settled quickly. The knight inspected the lands and froze taxes for their experimental farm. He promised to return soon, having become completely hooked on the local tomatoes. At farewell, the boys casually handed him a replacement for the lost sword. Vincent took the blade, portraying a painfully serious, stone face. Overall, the visit ended on a warm note, and the guest even apologized to Ellie. And it was pointless for him to be so tense about the weapon. That magical sword that he and Watts forged was just for fun, as a joke. Emptiness stretched all around. Suddenly the young man's face darkened. He still had not forgiven Vincent for those cheap flirtations with his friend. Throwing these thoughts away, he galloped through the forest riding the gigantic Shiro. The noble title gave him perfect excuses. Hiding behind fabricated inspections, he calmly shrugged off boring capital receptions. The sun quickly stretched toward the horizon, and the fluffy beast relentlessly carried him forward. The boy swiftly flew through the forest, riding the huge, fluffy wolf. He smiled carefreely and was about to speak when the beast suddenly jerked sharply. "Hey, Shiro, wait!" the youth shouted, barely managing to hold on to the fur. The beast dashed forward, but the rider froze in amazement. For the first time, he clearly saw what was ahead. In the thicket stood an elf woman. She was tightly surrounded by a ring of wild wolves. She tensed and froze, as if the very moment refused to move. The girl was exhausted and wounded. Blood slowly ran down her face, and her hand convulsively pressed against the bruised shoulder. The boy opened his eyes in shock. The elf girl mentally cursed the worst moment for an ambush. And suddenly a young man jumped out of the bushes, commanding his beast to come closer for a spell. Shiro let out a deafening roar, and with a powerful leap, burst right into the epicenter of the battle. The enemy predators were stunned and bared their teeth at the sudden rumble. The ground shook heavily under the massive paws, forcing the elf girl to recoil. The young man smiled confidently and cockily. At that very moment, a powerful surge of magic swept across the clearing. Everything in its path was swept away without a trace. The boy, with a happy smile, tightly hugged the huge white beast, burying himself in its thick fur. "That was cool! Well done, Shiro," he joyfully praised his fluffy friend. Suddenly, a wounded elf girl appeared nearby, and the boy hesitated confusedly. He asked worriedly if everything was all right, but the girl sharply raised her hand, ordering him to stay away. Blood was running down her cheek, and her gaze was so tense and hostile that the boy even recoiled. The elf girl stared at him in shock, demanding explanations, where a mere mortal had gotten a real Fenrir. And the legendary fearsome monster just tilted his head amusingly and barked innocently. He always heard that the legendary Fenrir is a terrifying beast that howls at the full moon. The boy recalled drawings from old books, but reality turned out to be much more comical. Before him sat a gigantic, fluffy giant. The so-called dreadful monster blinked trustingly with round eyes. An awkward silence hung in the air. Suddenly, the cry of a wounded elf shattered the silence. The girl fiercely laughed at his pitiful look, and the boy asked confusedly if the wolf had bitten her on the head. His gaze fell on a deep, bloody wound on her shoulder. The young man quietly noticed that the injury looked terrible, but in response received only a rude order: to be silent. While the wolf contentedly licked the face of his new friend, the girl was choking on hysterical screams about treacherous traps. The boy did not argue. He only raised his hand to the sky, and the space flashed with powerful magical light. The elf froze, as if she was instantly pinned down. He spoke matter-of-factly. "Let her keep calm until the bleeding completely stops." As soon as the treatment took effect, the young man gently patted his companion on the shoulder. The elf froze in shock, realizing the mighty magic worked without any spell, and the boy had already easily jumped onto the beast's back. He assured that he did not intend to harm her, and calmly rode away on the fluffy giant. The elf hesitantly pressed her lips, as if scratching a thought inside herself, and did not know what to answer. The boy was already riding away on his giant wolf when she suddenly called after him. The rider stopped, as if rooted to the spot. Breathing heavily, she asked, "Wait." Her gaze warmed and became almost pleading. The girl confessed. During reconnaissance, a beast attacked her, and while the others managed to retreat, she could not break free. The elf girl stopped and, embarrassed, raised her hand. She sincerely apologized to her rescuer for being rude to him. Now they were walking side by side, and the girl spoke quietly. Because she understood. Due to his young age, the boy did not yet know many things. She thanked him in the name of the forest spirits, but the young man was worried about something else entirely. He directly asked what had caused her recent warning. Memories stabbed with pain. She spoke about the horrors and humiliations their women and children had to endure. Because once it was humans who captured elves and shackled them with slave collars, the elf confessed. In the past, humans used her people as instruments of war, leaving behind only pain and rage. Since childhood, she was hammered with the idea that the human race are savages. But today's act of the boy dispelled these words. Continuing the path through the forest, Rain realized that he still hadn't named himself. The girl with a warm smile blessed him once again with a grateful word. He proudly named himself Reinford Proudlord, son of a baron entrusted with overseeing this forest. The elf introduced herself, Rhea. They sealed their acquaintance with a friendly handshake. Suddenly, Rein miscalculated their route and tensed sharply. It was long past time for him to return home. He stopped and sharply asked why they were moving away from the exit. Rhea calmly looked back and explained that they were heading to her settlement. Rain froze in place, not believing what he heard. Grabbing the tree trunk, he desperately objected in panic. A strict mother would simply destroy him for being late. Rhea called him by name in confusion. Peeking from behind the tree, Rein nervously whispered, "Maybe postpone the visit until tomorrow." And she, smiling, immediately agreed. Rhea playfully asked to skip the formalities, and at that very moment pushed Rein forward with all her might. The air split with a whistle. The strike was sudden and merciless. Rein screamed as he flew straight into the giant trunk. The tree was rapidly rolling closer, but instead of a deadly blow, he smoothly passed through the bark, which parted with soft, watery circles. Barrier magic, Rein realized in shock. The boy fell out of the illusion. He painfully fell to the ground and barely managed to curl up. Raising his eyes, he saw wooden houses built right on thick branches. Rein froze. Before him spread a secret settlement of elves. But he was not destined to admire the view. His neck was sharply burned by the cold of crossed spears. Rhea rushed to intercept the guard, desperately shielding her savior. But the enraged elves did not listen. They called for reinforcements and were ready to kill the human on the spot. The tension was cut by the whistle of the bowstring. An unknown archer released an arrow that fiercely struck the ground a millimeter from Rein's face. The boy sat evenly on the ground until the arrow, without unnecessary words, struck him right in the face. Suddenly, a ringing clatter of metal sounded. A shining dome reliably covered the youth, and the gigantic Fenrir fiercely snarled at the armed squad. The attackers froze, staring in shock at the broken arrows. Recognizing the sacred beast, they were even more horrified. But then little Lulu shouted desperately, "Stop the attack!" The tall elf Rhea instantly sprang forward and became a shield, covering the person with herself. She begged her tribesmen to believe her, but the crowd only whispered suspiciously. They said, "Elves do not trust humans and think the lady simply brainwashed them." Suddenly, a quick pounding sound was heard. A tearful girl rushed at Lulu, hugged her tightly, infinitely happy that she had returned alive. A stately leader stepped out of the crowd, and her icy voice sharply reprimanded the warriors for attacking the savior. The villagers confusedly hurried, trying to find an excuse, but she silenced everyone with a single order. She turned to the boy and sincerely apologized for the rudeness of her people. At that very moment, all the warriors of the tribe humbly dropped to their knees before him. The boy froze. The woman before him turned out to be an exact copy of Rhea. Two elf women carefully examined the unexpected guest. A full cup landed on the table with a light tap. The boy awkwardly hunched over in the chair surrounded by three hostesses. The freshly brewed tea looked too appetizing. He scolded himself in his thoughts for just going with the flow. And now he had no idea what he would say at home. A cautious sip, and he froze for a moment. His eyes suddenly widened. The unexpected taste hit the mark exactly. The delicate sweetness and fresh aroma, no cloying aftertaste, conquered him instantly. The elf girl smiled gently, pleased with such a reaction. Suddenly, a cold voice sounded with a question. Why is he not afraid that there might be poison in the tea? The boy only smiled sincerely. He had no idea that the villagers of his friend could have such intentions. Even on the way here, he felt on his back how the elves harbored deep hatred towards humans, despite the protection of the divine beast. But now he calmly continued holding the warm cup in his hands. The elf girl cheerfully waved off the warnings, asking again if anyone could really be hurt by this. In the silence, someone swallowed hard. Rhea burst out laughing loudly, and the young man blinked confusedly, as if he did not immediately understand what had happened. He only smiled awkwardly. The memory of his past life as a clerk struck his thoughts again. Few are capable of backing words with real actions. Rhea sharply leaned right into his face, suspecting something was wrong. For a human child, he behaved too maturely. Her older companion sighed and pulled the girl back, asking her to stop these jokes. But just as the conversation began to pick up, it was cut off by the appearance of a dignified elf. Ria's grandmother and the elder of the village, Rainford Proudlord. She looked intently at the guest and respectfully thanked him for saving her granddaughter. The young man nervously waved his hands, assuring that it was not he who scattered the pack, but Shiro. But Rainford did not believe such modesty and invited him to sit at the table for a serious conversation. The elder reported troubling news. Forest wolves had never come so close to the village before, and the number of magical beasts had begun to grow abnormally. It seems that somewhere deep in the thickets, something much more powerful has awakened. As soon as the rumor about the new dangerous monster reached the boy, he immediately became alert. It turned out that the alarm was caused by an ancient dragon. The boy cautiously asked again about the ancient dragon, and the elf woman grimly confirmed his suspicion. Suddenly, an unbearably heavy atmosphere hung in the room. Tension pressed from all sides, although only a conversation was taking place in the room. He smiled nervously and tried to reduce everything to a joke, saying it already sounded very cool, but inside he was sweating all over, as if he was justifying himself again before an angry client. The elf woman's gaze instantly became icy. If only the problem were really limited to just a cool name. Carefully choosing his words, he asked if these creatures usually sleep at all. In response, she referred to the ancient legends of her ancestors. Hearing this, the boy almost burst out shouting. It turned out that the monster had fallen asleep in the heart of the forest 2,000 years ago. According to legends, after 3 millennia of slumber, the beast was supposed to wake up and throw the world into an unprecedented crisis. Now it became clear why there was not a single word about this in the parental library. Outside, the rain stubbornly hammered down. They silently listened to the sound of the downpour. The rain incessantly pounded the cobblestones, and the tense silence lasted so long that everyone had time to replay what they heard in their heads. The boy grimaced nervously in a smile. The scale of the threat simply did not fit into his thoughts. Puzzled, he barely whispered that it was almost like the end of the world. He shifted his gaze to the interlocutors and cautiously inquired whether it was not too early for the apocalypse. By about a whole 1,000 years. A tense silence hung in the air. The boy felt uneasy, and he quickly tried to blame it all on the inaccuracies of ancient legends. The large, fluffy beast suddenly burst out laughing loudly, and the elf woman confessed plainly, they themselves do not know the truth. With a slight sad note, she explained that their knowledge was based only on fragmentary stone chronicles, so such a huge time gap caught everyone by surprise. The boy thoughtfully rubbed his chin and asked Rain what exactly could have caused this disruption. The mystery gave him no peace. Rain tensed and clasped her hands tightly. Could the World Destroyer have awakened a millennium earlier? The boy eagerly began to propose theories. Someone might have stolen the seal, broken the hidden crystal, or the elves themselves seriously messed up somewhere. At such a bold assumption, Ryan only smiled awkwardly and looked away. She quickly assured, there is simply no one in the village with such power, and immediately shifted the conversation to another troubling news, the appearance of the Orc King. This monster was a mutant, a genuine, walking, natural disaster, and he was noticed very recently, right near their settlement. The elf admitted bitterly, against such a threat, their people would never stand a chance. So the only way out was to build a gigantic barrier to protect the village from danger. The elf girl explained the action of little Lulu. Her father was maimed by a frenzied beast, so the girl desperately went into the forest herself to get healing herbs. It was there that Fenrir attacked her, and the child was barely saved. Suddenly, the woman raised her index finger and warned that what follows are only her personal guesses. She hesitantly began to share her thoughts. Her words seemed to hang in the air. Silence reigns. In the complete darkness, magical sparks flickered. The tension rapidly increased, and the final conclusion was announced. The sleeping dragon woke up not by accident. It was a direct reaction to the flash of colossal power. The boy's eyes suddenly widened from the shocking realization. The boy crossed his arms over his chest and thoughtfully said that now everything is falling into place. He understood. One Orc King alone could not have caused such a mess. So in his mind, he was already looking for the real culprit. Anger boiled rapidly. That damn bastard. But the elf girls suddenly interrupted him, hastily assuring that he was mistaken. The boy blinked confusedly, not understanding why they stared at him so strangely. His gaze slid under the table, and there, as it turned out, the fluffy beast reacted only to immense magical power, so everything instantly became clear. He laughed awkwardly, and immediately realized how hard it was for them to say this directly to his face. The girls together blushed deeply, stunned that he had understood everything anyway. He only smiled conciliatorily. Their hints were more than enough. And just as the conversation returned to the matter, the elf women sighed resignedly. They had no more concrete leads. Then he moved on to the main point. Is there any weapon against dragons in their ancient legends? The girlfriends fell silent anxiously. The elf woman helplessly shrugged and described the true horror. No blade can pierce the scales, the jaws crush the earth, and the dragon's flame leaves only dead ashes behind. The boy leaned heavily on the table and feverishly turned over the thought in his head. Do they have even the slightest chance to defeat such a monster in direct combat? The elf girl described the dragon with horror. Impenetrable scales, devastating jaws, and flames that burn everything to ashes. She admitted that in all her long years, she had never met anyone who could defeat it. Suddenly, the boy raised a finger and suggested, "Let's just talk to the monster." He sat at the table, rubbed his chin, and firmly decided to act according to this plan. The elf girl asked hopefully if he really had some idea. The boy joyfully confirmed that he would go to the dragon, and this made the girls break out in a cold sweat. In hysteria, they screamed for him to talk to it alone already. An awkward silence hung. The girls were gasping heavily after the scream, and the big white dog just looked confusedly. The boy froze in confusion. The elf women sharply turned away, pretending to whistle, and shamelessly declared that there was no one else to go. He pointed at himself in shock, and immediately realized he had just been sent to certain death. "I'm just an ordinary sweet 10-year-old boy," he shouted in panic, looking at the empty face of his friend, but his desperate cries drowned in absolute indifference. The boy continued to wave his hands desperately, insisting that he was a completely normal child. The elf woman looked seriously at Rain and began the report. She listed what she found in the forest, giant chasms and lakes, and because of this, the boy nervously shrank. The mention of the mutilated earthen walls made him sweat even more. Words about a furious surge of magic finally revealed the cards. Before Ryan's eyes flashed their destructive training. There was no doubt. It was this magical burst that awakened the sleeping dragon. The girl ironically raised a finger, quoting the report about the appearance of anomalous power in the world. Rain resignedly flopped face down on the table, realizing the battle was inevitable. Gathering his courage, he cautiously asked about the monster's dimensions. His partner sternly inquired whether he had at least some excuse, but the boy only looked away guiltily. The elf woman put a finger to her lips and tried to recall the details. Her answer was shocking. The dragon was so huge that it could completely cover an entire settlement. A drop fell from the leaf, and Rain noticed that the downpour was finally subsiding. The elf in the cloak turned away, entrusting the boy to also come up with some plan. It was already late, so they decided to postpone the conversation until tomorrow. A heavy hand encouragingly rested on Ryan's shoulder. They were counting on him. The moon peeked through the clouds, and the boy had no idea where to start. He stretched his shoulders and decided to at least come up with something to begin with. Rain and Rhea were walking slowly along the rocky path. The boy casually asked the girl to find him some shed to spend the night in the company of Shiro. Rhea suddenly stopped and looked at him in shock. She sincerely resented such a request and scolded the boy, to the point that she directly suggested he come to her place. Her cheeks slightly reddened as she quietly asked again if he really did not want to stay with her, which made Rain blush. In his head, true chaos reigned, the very first night in this world, and immediately at the girl's home. Ryan muttered that he did not want to trouble her relatives, and Rhea calmly replied. Her family had long been exterminated, taken into slavery through magic, and thrown into war. She smiled gently and assured him in her empty house, he would disturb no one. Rain froze in horror when he heard that elves were taken into slavery and thrown to death in wars only because of their magic. In the middle of the forest path, Rhea stopped, quietly apologized, and lowered her gaze. She smiled softly and confessed that, thanks to him, she finally understood. People can be different. Before, she would have hated him along with everyone else, as just another cruel stranger, but he saved her life. Suddenly, the girl sharply waved her hand. Rain blinked confusedly. The elf woman spread her arms wide toward the moonlight. Her parents were no more, but now every villager was her family. She gently asked the boy to wipe the sadness from his face. Rhea confidently promised she would become his personal shield against those who still did not trust people. At such words, Ryan's cheeks instantly flushed. The elf woman also became terribly embarrassed and began to awkwardly confess her affection. until a sharp child's cry interrupted the romance. Little Lulu rushed into her arms at full speed, and Ria joyfully hugged the girl, forgetting about the awkwardness. The boy explained that they went for a walk, so late because their father wanted to stretch, so his body wouldn't go numb. Ria smiled warmly and gently brushed off the thanks for caring about Lulu. Rain blinked in surprise. When the stranger noticed the boy, the elf girl awkwardly looked away and muttered that he should be thanked, too. From the shadows stepped a burly man with a wooden prosthetic leg. Rain awkwardly scratched the back of his head, trying to reduce everything to the fact that he and Shiro just happened to be nearby. He didn't finish speaking. Ria sharply leaned forward and finished his statement as if in passing. She was already 52 years old. She began to lecture the boy that wandering in the forest at 10 years old was too dangerous. The elf girl smugly lifted her nose, but Rain immediately deflated her pride. By the same logic, she should also be 10. The boy flinched indignantly, sharply breaking forward. Everything fell into place. The cunning elf girl was simply hiding her real age behind the status of older sister. Ria flared up with anger at the insolent human children, but Rain, with a victorious smile, finished her off. No matter how old she was, she behaved like a child, and that, he said, was ordinary demagogy. They bumped foreheads, throwing lightning glances at each other. Suddenly, their quarrel was interrupted by someone's heavy hand. A blonde little elf threw at Rain. Although grateful that he saved Ria, people here should not get arrogant. While the girl was shyly hiding behind, the boy disdainfully said that it does not suit her at all to associate with such scoundrels. An adult elf with a scar on his face approached from the side and sharply cut in. He despises the human race, period. Ria immediately stood between them, pleading to step back and not touch the young man who saved her life. Another elf woman carefully picked up the mutilated man and decided to lead the locals away. She smiled warmly at Ria in farewell. Left alone with Rain, Ria lowered her head and quietly apologized for that scuffle. Lars was walking away, but still muttered a curse dully after the stranger. The girl sadly watched them with her eyes and explained, "The man with the scar is the hunter Lars, crippled by a magical beast. Elven hatred towards humans has taken too deep root in this village." With pain in her voice, Ria admitted, her own helplessness is tearing her apart from the inside. She clenched her fist until the knuckles turned white. A broken body chained Lars to crutches, so he simply poured out his despair on Rain. But Ria's gaze flared with determination. If a dragon comes, she will defend the village to the last, even if they crush her head or burn her alive. With tears in her eyes, Ria confessed. She is terrified to death of losing new friends who have become her family, just as she once lost her parents. Rain shouted her name in shock. The boy rushed to bandage her wound, ignoring the girl's request to take care of himself. He was bleeding himself. She looked at him in surprise. Rain asked calmly if many villagers were still injured. The elf confirmed. There were plenty of wounded. Without raising his eyes, he asked to gather everyone in one place, which greatly puzzled Ria. With a tense face, the boy begged, "Let him be trusted." For this gathering, a spacious night glade was prepared, illuminated by torches. In the darkness, silhouettes of dozens of battered residents moved toward the improvised stage. Rain decisively stepped forward. In the crowd, an irritated murmur was growing. The elves could not understand why a human child was taken from home in the middle of the night, when wounds hurt the most. The boy stepped onto the platform before the dissatisfied villagers, and loudly apologized for disturbing them at such a time. He stood before the crowd with outstretched arms, completely open, ready to listen to any complaints. While Ria anxiously pondered what exactly his plan looked like, angry shouts were already pouring from the crowd. They demanded to abandon Fenrir and immediately leave the village. The elves irritably questioned what exactly he intended to do with them. The boy only smiled carefreely, trying to calm Ria. The elf, bound by an unknown force, screamed wildly that the girl was being manipulated and hissed faintly with a threat. He would throw the stranger out, if only he could move. Instead, the boy winked at the confused Ria and declared that he just wanted to peacefully resolve their little neighborly problem. But this only enraged the elves. One of them barked that the miserable human should not dare interfere with the management of their forest. Then the young man calmly stepped forward from the crowd and announced that he was the eldest son of the Baron, whom the kingdom had entrusted to oversee this territory. He politely cleared his throat and introduced himself. Rainford Proudlord. Immediately, furious shouts erupted from the crowd. to tear the boy apart and make a bloody example of him for the rest. The elves exploded with curses and refused to recognize human laws. But Rainford continued speaking unflinchingly. But suddenly the screamers fell silent in confusion. Rainford said coldly that he understood their feelings, and at the same time, a wild magic of the wind swirled around him. His gaze became icy. From behind the boy emerged a giant black wolf, and the elves instantly screamed in pure horror. They immediately recognized in him the divine beast, Fenrir. Their anger vanished as quickly as the animalistic panic tremor awakened. The white beast fiercely bared its fangs and growled hoarsely, not taking its eyes off the hand stretched out to it. "Shiro," a calm voice spoke, as if not noticing the wolf's furious rage. The young man cheerfully winked, and with one brief dossier put everything in its place. He was Renford Proudlord, 26 years old, and he was from Earth. Someone invisible asked in surprise why this sudden introduction, but the reason turned out to be surprisingly simple. Although once the goddess herself had gifted this audacious provincial with magic, now things were bad. Renford stood before a gigantic spiked dragon and perfectly understood. If he did not speak out now, while he still breathed, there would be no other chance. A nervous, resigned smile froze on his face. Nearby, an elf blinked confusedly, when from the pulsating black aura, an otherworldly voice burst out, urging them on. The boy flinched, unable to suppress a shudder, from the sharp shout of the impatient entity. The gloom aggressively spread, hungrily touching something invisible, as if demanding food. The dragon fiercely opened its jaws, and the shadow solemnly proclaimed, "The time has come to fulfill the ancient pact." The monster slowly turned its head to the tiny elder of the elves. The girl froze in confusion, and then honestly exclaimed that she had not the slightest idea what it was all about. Someone awkwardly lowered their head, and suddenly remembered the contract, as if it were some old, completely insignificant trifle. The elf woman stepped forward unhurriedly. She cynically declared to the dragon, "The terms of their pact, made 2 millennia ago, have long been erased from memory." A heavy voice of the beast sharply interrupted her. It had just sensed a huge surge of magic nearby. "Enough jokes," thundered the dragon. Its roar melted into the starry sky. A dense black aura filled the space. The boy's eyes widened with a terrible suspicion. The dragon loomed over the company and coldly proclaimed, "The source of this magic will become the perfect offering." The elf instantly oriented herself. She forced a nervous smile and, without a trace of shame, betrayed the boy. A string of choice curses flared up in his head at such a vile betrayal. A tense pause hung. Not a sound, only a heavy premonition. The beast lowered its snout all the way to the ground and scrutinized the victim whom the elf forcibly pushed forward. The dragon indignantly rejected this worthless human offering, while the boy desperately shouted at his partner for the setup. But in a moment, the mighty lizard sharply changed tone. He saw in this small body a true otherworldly power. Rainford swallowed tensely when nearby someone remarked in surprise, "All the boy's strength comes from the Fenrir cub on his back." The youth nervously smiled at the giant dragon on the rock, stated his name, and politely asked not to be eaten. Instead, the giant maw opened wide in the frame, fiercely accusing him of violating an ancient, sacred pact. The monster coldly cut him off. It did not care at all about the pitiful problems of small creatures. Rainford and his 2 companions froze, like tiny insects, before the absolute indifference of the lizard. A heavy clawed paw slammed into the ground with a crash, reinforcing a brief threat in case of refusal. A tall column of smoke and dust rose into the sky from the impact. The dragon menacingly spread its wings and promised first to break the insolent's bones, and only then to devour him. The boy's eyes instantly widened. A sharp awareness of danger struck without warning. He jerked sharply backward. One single thought echoed in his mind. A direct hit means death without chances. The space was cleaved by a lightning-fast strike. Renford barely managed to raise his hand in a block, shrinking under the devastating force of the attack. The young man clenched his teeth and held the block with all his might under the pressure of the crushing blow. The shockwave whistled as it cut through the space. The ground beneath his feet split open with deep cracks from the furious force. The boy was thrown backward, like a rag doll. He harshly tore through the bushes with his back. Wincing in pain, he exhaled heavily. Good thing he managed to activate the magical shield, otherwise this power would have ground him to dust. Consciousness sharply clouded, and his body was gripped by a terrifyingly familiar sensation from a past life, just like when he was once hit by a truck. Complete darkness, and only one thought pounding in his chest. Could he really die again? Before his eyes flashed a new life he had come to love, the saved lands of the kingdom, close people, and pure delight for magic. Exhausted, he mentally said goodbye to his sister Ellie, feeling this time he definitely would not make it out. Suddenly through the haze, the outline of a huge eye appeared. A huge white muzzle bent down right above him. The boy was stunned and suddenly sat up. Nearby stood the familiar giant wolf. He froze in surprise. The beast gently nudged him with its nose, and the boy breathed out the name of his fluffy friend with relief. Shiro. The exhausted beast whimpered faintly. The boy shuddered and called his friend in fear. His trembling hands touched the fur of the heavily breathing Shiro. Sitting next to the wounded wolf, he bitterly realized, even in such a state, he still worries about him. Around stretched only the wasteland ravaged by the explosion. The blow flashed before his eyes again. Shiro had covered him from the fall with his own body. The first tears fell on the beast's paw, and the boy whispered, "Stupid, stupid Shiro." His fingers clung tightly to the white fur. He sobbed bitterly, realizing the price his friend had paid for his life. The boy bit his lip hard, holding back despair. He quietly asked the wolf not to move and to gather strength. He took a sharp, merciless step forward. Shaking off all fear, he rushed straight under the jaws of the giant black dragon to finish off the monster. Clenching the shining amulet, the boy snarled fiercely. There was nowhere to retreat, and hesitation was no longer a matter of courage. The invisible enemy laughed maliciously. "Stop whining. The Fenrir cub will never die from such a trifle." Rage flared in the boy's eyes, hot and merciless. He sharply threw his hands forward and hurled the shining mass straight into the whirlpool of darkness. His entire voice broke into a scream. He fiercely cursed his opponent. The strike crashed into the giant dragon's jaw with a crack. The space was torn apart by a colossal shockwave. The boy stared motionless at the wall of fire. The attack had undoubtedly reached its target. But as soon as the smoke cleared, the lizard was still standing. This was not enough for victory. The monster fiercely bared its fangs, as if savoring the moment. The monster rumbled, and it became clear. The human child, it seems, really turned out to be impressive. But there was no panic. The boy calmly lit another sphere in his hand, making the dragon flinch. The beast stared at the boy in astonishment. The boy was already sitting casually on the ground near the exhausted knight, and was casually laying out a plan. A sharp thermal strike will pierce even the thickest scale. High above them, a new, gigantic sphere of destructive energy was already forming. The giant dragon suddenly straightened up and raised a destructive shockwave. The force of the explosion instantly threw the boy backward. A massive stone boulder nearby cracked, but he stubbornly held his gaze and promised, "No one else will suffer." With a weak smile on his battered face, he firmly declared that he would not surrender either his home or his people to destruction. His eyes flared with rage, and he burst into a shout, swearing to personally ensure the safety of his loved ones. The monster fiercely bared its teeth in response to the boy's threat, to make him pay for all he had done. The giant dragon opened its jaws and loomed over the small boy. From afar, two elves watched them fearfully. Rhea tensely confirmed grandmother's guess. The boy sharply flew upward, releasing energy, and without uttering a single word of the spell, a hard landing. Rain flared with an aura right before the monster's claws, revealing an unfathomable number of his attributes. The elf woman's eye twitched, and suddenly everything fell into place. An ordinary body would have been torn to pieces, because even a higher race cannot merge two elements. But he crossed fire and ice in destructive mixed magic without any strain. The air buzzed, shuddered, and stirred in a wild whirlwind. His dark silhouette glowed with a bottomless ocean of mana, driving animal fear deep into the dragon's eyes. A bright flash struck the eyes like lightning from within the darkness. The women were petrified. The picture of the magical world they so stubbornly held in their imagination had just shattered completely. Rain stood triumphantly on the height with an open book, like a true deity from ancient myths. The elf woman, with lips agape in amazement, exclaimed that the ancient dragon turned out to be too easy to lure out. She whispered Rhine's name with anxiety. The monster sharply raised its head. A deafening roar tore through the air. The boy was feverishly calculating. His fire and ice magic wounded the beast, but did not kill it. A dazzling beam of energy shot out from the dragon's jaws. A realization flashed in Rain's eyes. He already understood exactly how to act. He barely managed to dive behind a stone boulder, and at that very moment took a devastating blow. His face twisted with tension. The stone cracked threateningly, emitting a snap from every fissure. A wild exhaustion surged. Mass healing of people and hard work in the field before the battle had drained too much strength. Meanwhile, the dragon heavily stepped to the edge of the cliff, looming over its prey. The beast squinted fiercely, and the boy mentally counted the pitiful remnants of his mana. The giant monster mockingly growled that Reinford had no options left. The boy smiled boldly and wiped his chin, not objecting. The dragon roared with delight, sincerely appreciating such honesty. A magical circle began to form in the monster's jaws. Out of respect, the monster decided to incinerate the enemy with its strongest move. The young man clenched his teeth and covered his face. A furious gust of wind raged right in his face. But suddenly, from the sky, right between them, an unknown discharge struck, and the lizard froze in surprise before the blasted crater. The boy stared in shock at the crowd of confused people who had just appeared out of thin air, and then a giant stone sphere crashed onto the battlefield with a dull rumble. The ground around it instantly began to crack under the pressure of terrible tension. In all this madness, even the roof of some house, accidentally teleported here, was visible as nothing else. The boy wearily gazed into this bacchanalia, and already clearly understood who had interrupted his fight. At that very moment, a lightning-fast slash cut through the space. A massive black weapon swung and struck directly into the monster. The colossal blow simply dented the giant dragon's face into the mud. The dragon opened its jaws, and magical energy swirled between its fangs. The ball of light rapidly gained power. Giant magical circles flared in the air before the monster. The boy suddenly turned pale. It was not an ordinary attack. It resembled a unique, deadly skill. Mana was absorbed into those lace patterns with insane speed. The young man slapped his cheeks, driving away panic. Any delay would cost him his life. He fell to one knee and urgently focused on creating a multi-layer barrier. A wall of several light shields instantly rose before him. Despite the animal fear of the attack, he reliably covered the small companion with his body. Clenching his teeth, the boy mentally swore he would not lose and would return to his family at any cost. At that very moment, the dragon unleashed a colossal stream of energy. A dazzling beam with a terrifying roar smashed through the defense. Everything around was engulfed by a white flash. A swift movement of a dark mass cut through the air. A devastating beam of energy crashed into the magical shields behind which the boy was hiding. He tensed to the limit, desperately holding the defense, but the giant dragon only fiercely bared its fangs. The enemy volleys struck with renewed force. Under the fierce pressure, the barrier burst with deep cracks. The boy heavily sank to one knee, feeling the mana rapidly depleting. He muttered a muffled curse. The shield finally shattered in a flash, and he flinched in shock. Suddenly, the space filled with dense wind magic. A furious whirlwind grew right before him, reliably blocking the deadly strike. The air roared, twisting into an impenetrable wall. Behind his back emerged the giant snout of a white beast, and the boy, not believing what he saw, exclaimed, "Shiro!" A sob burst from his chest, and tears of relief welled up in his eyes. "Let's go, Shiro!" shouted Rain, and the enemy opposite nervously broke out in sweat. The opponent's body twitched, tensing to the limit. His eyes suddenly widened. Fear washed over him like a wave. From the magic circle, a crocodile maw burst out with a predatory roar. Rain gritted his teeth. Mana had slightly recovered, but although the enemy's strength was also fading, there was still nothing to stop this blow. Suddenly, the boy's figure flared with an unexpected glow. He froze in surprise, as if he did not believe his own eyes. Somewhere far behind, a pillar of bright light shot into the sky. A desperate girl's scream rang out, and Rain felt as if struck. Someone was sharing mana with him. The elves solemnly pressed their palms together, preparing for action. A whole crowd gathered in a joint prayer, giving their last crumbs of energy. A grateful smile blossomed on the boy's face. The imagination immediately opened to the pure, boundless blue of the sky. His eyes lit up again with excitement. To waste such a chance would be simply a crime. High in the sky, Inside giant clouds, trillions of ice particles incessantly collided. They were swiftly caught by powerful updrafts. The ice crystals flew higher and higher, wildly rubbing against each other and gathering static charge. But this electrified mass had not yet fallen to the ground. In the darkness, a threatening spark flashed, as if the twilight itself was preparing a strike. The dragon confusedly raised its snout, not understanding what plan its small opponent had hatched. At that very moment, the heavens opened with a hail of shining arrows. They flew straight at the monster. The youth's voice stated evenly and without trembling. The lizard's scales are incredibly strong. Its body was as hard as stone. The beast, gripped by primal terror, watched the light and wondered if heavenly arrows were falling right on him. The boy smiled fiercely and pronounced the verdict. This steel armor would become a deadly weakness for the monster. With a deafening cry, he unleashed a colossal pillar of lightning on the reptile. A dazzling electric discharge pierced through the space. The destructive energy of the blow instantly swallowed everything around. A powerful explosion tore the space apart, scattering it into dozens of dazzling lightning bolts. A thick cloud of dust covered the ground, and in this silence, the name Rain was barely audible. The elf covered her face from the gusting wind, anxiously trying to make out the dragon in the smoke. Suddenly her eyes widened in horror. In despair, she stretched out a trembling hand forward. Straining her voice, the girl rushed to help, but suddenly froze. Rain was completely unharmed and was waving cheerfully, comfortably settled near the giant sleeping beast. Rain lay exhausted on the grass near the gigantic fluffy beast. The boy simply smiled joyfully at the sky, enjoying the long-awaited rest. Suddenly, Rhea crashed down on him with a loud scream. Pressed down and embarrassed, Rain barely squeezed out through his lips that this girl was too heavy for him, but she only clung tighter to his shirt, crying tears of joy that he had survived. Their figures were sinking against the backdrop of the carcass of the fallen dragon. The boy himself did not understand how he survived this slaughter without a single scratch. Suddenly, a click went off in his head. He gently ran his palm over Rhea's back and quietly apologized for all the nerves he had ruined for her. Before their eyes, danger flashed for a moment. The monster broke free from the trap and burst straight outside. Their almost idyllic moment was mercilessly broken by the elf woman. She hovered over the couple and, boldly pursing her lips, offered advice. Flirting, let it wait. She kindly extended her hand, sincerely impressed by how the boy had dealt with such a monster. Rain and Rhea immediately jumped up, comically and panickedly fussing with excuses before the spiteful woman, whom the boy in hysteria managed to call grandmother. Rain grabbed her hand, squinted, and sharply emphasized that he had not forgotten. Not long ago, the elf woman tried to set him up, but in a moment the expression on his face changed. He warmly thanked the whole team for lending him their strength. The tall elf woman smiled kindly and firmly shook the confused youth's hand. The elder elf suddenly confidently grabbed the boy by the shoulders. Without his magical support, they would definitely have lost. The man leaned closer and, seriously insisting, said that they were in godless debt to the savior. The young man even recoiled, blinking. The sudden attention knocked the ground from under his feet. The elf stepped back a step and, theatrically waving his hand, bowed deeply. He solemnly thanked Rainford on behalf of the forest gods, honestly admitting, otherwise the monster would have devoured them. Lars smiled warmly, recalling how desperately the boy fought with the sacred beast for their forest. All the other elves immediately lined up in a row and bowed so low that the elf woman burst out shouting, begging to stop this officialdom. Renford hastily waved his hands. To him, all the locals were simply neighbors who needed help in trouble. Someone gently tousled the boy's hair, as if praising his heroism, while he blushed and stubbornly called himself ordinary. Lars awkwardly sweated, recalling how harsh and hostile their meeting had been at first. The elf interrupted the conversation. She asked if the transferred magic was some special spell. The young man was about to answer no, but suddenly froze. A strand on his crown twitched sharply, suggesting an unexpected guess. Suddenly he faltered, as if a thought struck his head, and it became clear. Something indeed had happened. The elf smiled reassuringly, that even humans can transfer magic if they have a core for it. She extended a pendant with an empty stone. The boy exhaled in surprise, and immediately recognized the magical artifact. But something was wrong. The stone, for some reason, did not shine at all. A surprised, "Wait, hung in the air. The girl proudly explained that this was an ancient treasure of her people, an object capable of accumulating the power poured into it. But now the stone is black because all the energy has just been transferred from it to the boy. She warned, to restore the color, it would take hundreds of years. But the boy carelessly caught the ornament. The elf girl suggested not to wait. Instead, just gradually fill it with magic over time. Suddenly, in the hands of the smiling youth, the stone flashed with a dazzling glow, causing the companions to freeze. The girl screamed. He had just exhausted all his strength, and the boy naively replied that he had only rested for a couple of minutes. The elf stared in shock at the artifact. The pendant shone even brighter than before being drained, and she sharply grabbed the boy's hands. The stunned elf girl directly asked if he was perhaps a monster or some kind of anomaly, and he only grumbled offendedly that it was rude. Rain blushed deeply. He had just realized that he had spoken his thoughts aloud again. The girl next to him was already begging to change her body. After such exhaustion, no living creature would survive even a day, let alone move. Instead, Rain clenched his fist tightly. His magic had almost fully returned. He turned to Rhea and casually asked if he could take the defeated dragon for himself. Without hesitation, he went straight to the giant carcass. The elf girl nodded confusedly, not knowing what he would do with this mountain of flesh, while in the background the rescued elder rejoiced. Rhine quietly apologized, and a powerful beam of light burst from outstretched hands. Everyone present froze in silent shock. The boy just calmly smiled. A magical impulse ran through the dragon's body, causing the monster to groan dully and twitch. Sparks continued to fall on the scales as Rain finally admitted. He had planned all this in the middle of the battle. Suddenly the giant's jaws opened wide, and with a stream of dark energy came a wild roar. The monster seemed to find it incredibly delicious. Rain and Rhea froze with completely blank faces, as if the words had fled from them together. Meanwhile, the beast stubbornly and contentedly vibrated in the black fog, releasing eerie sounds. Absorbing the healing magic, the dragon swooned with pleasure, recognizing it as the tastiest manna of its entire life. A prolonged purring escaped from his tusked maw. The formidable giant sprawled on the ground and purred like a giant kitten before the bewildered hero's eyes. But suddenly, the lizard realized what was happening and abruptly froze. Rain smiled sincerely, joyfully, from the heart, delighted by the recovery of his former enemy. The dragon briefly boiled with indignation at such a handout, but the young man calmly interrupted him and stated he had 3 reasons for the healing. Calming down a bit, the giant grimly agreed to listen. Although his pride still rebelled, living after defeat by an ordinary human seemed an unbearable disgrace. Ryan raised his index finger. He noticed. Before his fiery breath, the dragon deliberately shifted the line of attack away from the village. The girls behind froze in shock. The monster had no intention of destroying anything from the very beginning. The second reason struck Kanade even more. The lizard didn't even have time to truly engage in the fight. The giant continued to silently loom over the boy, not denying these words. Rain did not take his eyes off the monster. If it really craved blood, it would have burned the forest from the air, or buried them under boulders, and instantly destroyed the entire squad. The boy smiled slyly, and urged to just think. He looked at the giant and admitted, the last attack was definitely not the limit of his strength, as painful as it is to accept. The youth defiantly asked if the lizard could hit much harder. I answered in a way that left no doubt. It was obvious. The dragon grimly confirmed, if he fought seriously, not a trace of the entire continent would remain. The elf girl intervened and reminded about the third reason, but the boy immediately asked not to look for deep meaning in it. He awkwardly looked away. The girl stubbornly waited for explanations, as if every second was finally supposed to reveal the truth. The giant lizard quietly snorted, listening carefully to the answer. The young man calmly said that he simply did not want anyone to die. And these words broke the silence with the dragon's thunderous laughter. Having caught his breath, the monster admitted, a long sleep is quite justified if such interesting people appear afterward. The golden eye narrowed thoughtfully. Could it really have been 2,000 years? Hearing this number, the boy twitched instantly and asked why the sleep had been delayed for so long. An old elven legend surfaced in memory, and the dragon quietly explained. He was forced to fall asleep by an elf who was once his friend. Ryan hesitantly lost his train of thought, asking the dragon looming over them whether he still intended to eat them. The beast only snorted in surprise, as if to say, Why would he spoil his stomach? The elf woman indignantly poked him with her finger, reminding him how he had just scared them with dreadful sacrifices and pacts. The dragon spoke of an ancient agreement. After a millennium of sleep, the descendants of the elves were to bring him a powerful mage who would feed him the magic of light. That's what a friend once told me. His deep voice sounded in his pauses. The girl blinked, and suddenly it dawned on her. The legendary world crisis was actually a banal shortage of magical energy. The beast looked intently at Rhine, acknowledging. Until now, no one had possessed the magic of light with such power. He stepped forward heavily and corrected her. After all, it was not just a shortage, but a genuine global catastrophe. The elf woman with a stone expression agreed. Back then, the world had indeed almost perished from exhaustion. Suddenly, the monster abruptly turned to the boy. With a dull rumble, the huge ancient dragon sprawled on the ground and begged Rain to feed him magic, at least occasionally. Otherwise, he would not survive. The boy flinched in surprise when this formidable beast plaintively asked to be treated like a poor little lamb. The beast obediently pressed its snout into the ground and continued whining for help. The elf woman simply screamed in shock. The legendary ancient dragon was crawling before them on its belly. The elf girl nearly fainted with panic when Rain easily agreed to the giant lizard's terms. The boy sincerely assured that he was ready to share his magic any time. Inspired by this, the new ally resolutely declared that he too needed to prepare properly. A mighty roar tore through the air. Flying over the very cliff, the dragon announced yet another unfinished business. With a deafening roar, he reminded the forest monsters once again who the real master here was, and loudly said goodbye to Rain. The winged silhouette dissolved into the sky, and the elf girl anxiously asked whether this deal had been too reckless. Rain just carelessly waved it off. He was convinced that he would simply visit the dragon in the village occasionally and pass him some magic, and at that time he was truly, absolutely sure of it. Only later did the boy realize how truly difficult that promise could be. Rain froze, staring at the dense, dark aura that pulsated threateningly right before him. A sinister shadow tore the space with dull, eerie sounds. The boy was suddenly pierced by cold sweat. Dinner was that very continuous horror. A special elven salad and meat sauté on the plates looked like a life-threatening pixelated mess. The little familiar stared at the dish in shock, while the elf Rhea was only genuinely surprised. Do humans really not know such simple home cooking? She smiled happily, already anticipating the tasting, and asked why Rain was not eating. The boy convulsively twisted his thoughts, searching for salvation. To eat this and not die, he immediately needed Shiro's bottomless stomach. But the trap had already snapped. Rhea happily wagged her ears at the table, and Rhine hopelessly stared at the food, realizing he was in deep trouble. With his last hope, he glanced at the corner of the room. The boy's face twitched from the realization of merciless betrayal. What a petty coward. Shiro pressed his nose firmly against the wall and trembled slightly, as if he was not here at all. The outrage was growing stronger and stronger. The little cowardly creature seemed to have broken through, and it had become completely insolent. And Shiro himself, hiding, pretended as if he was not even close here. Rhea pressed her palms to her chest with offense. Could he really refuse her food? Rain immediately broke out in a cold sweat and tried to excuse himself with sudden nausea. Her sad gaze left Rain no chance to find a way to escape. The boy nervously forced a smile. Suddenly, two other elf girls ran up to them with cheerful cries. Realizing there was nowhere to run, Rain closed his eyes and resignedly commanded to start the meal. And then birds flew down from the forest. The next moment, he was already lying on the table, without any signs of life. The friends realized with horror the boy dared to taste Rhea's dish, the very one even dragons flee from. While the half-alive Rain gawked at their panic, the elf girls rushed to brew tea, saving his taste receptors. A hot cup rang as it was set down on the table. After the very first sip, Rain melted into a grateful smile, and Rhea suddenly asked if he was leaving the village tomorrow. He sighed with relief, feeling life returning to him. Rhea sadly lowered her gaze. Rhine admitted that he wanted to leave today, to avoid worrying his mother, but he had overslept too long. Then the girl intertwined her fingers and looked as seriously as possible. Before leaving, she, like the leader of the elves, has a request for him. Rain calmly took a sip as soon as he was called. He placed a document with a new request before the elf Lulu. Lulu listened carefully to the proposal. A moment later, surprise sounded. Before them stood a simple wooden hut. Next to it rose a solid stone wall. Rain rushed headlong to the door, followed joyfully by a huge, fluffy dog. The boy cautiously peeked from behind the corner. Quickly, quietly, and as if fear itself was pushing him back. In the darkness, a creepy smile flickered. He was caught trying to run away from home. A sinister shadow loomed over him, and, like a caress, spoke his name. Ryan froze with horror. It was his mother, and he didn't even have time to feel her approach. The sentence was delivered instantly. The woman ordered him to present himself for punishment, and the boy let out a desperate scream. She theatrically covered her face with her palm, openly enjoying his belated repentance. The mother threw her son over her knee and began to beat him cruelly, instilling lessons about night monsters, while Rain begged for mercy through tears. The carriage was already rushing away swiftly, and the beaten boy was feverishly tormented by thoughts in despair. How to get out of this story in the future? Rain shrank, panicking as he realized that he was about to get his ass severely kicked. Suddenly, thunder rumbled outside, and a cheerful shout was heard, as if someone was finally home. A carriage pulled up to the yard, the wheels clattering loudly on the cobblestones. Hope flared up, so strong it took his breath away. The boy's eyes suddenly widened. He recognized his salvation. He sprang from his place and dashed like an arrow towards the coach, overtaking his mother. Without catching his breath, Rain jumped onto his father at full speed and clung tightly, with a death grip, to his doublet. The mother stopped, trembling with sincere emotion. Such a warm reunion scene tore at the heart. The father laughed loudly, holding them tightly in his arms, and Rain desperately agreed, just not to be let go. The younger sister, Ellie, timidly peeked out from behind the wall, but the father instantly crushed his attempt to wriggle free, reminding him that after his mother's punishment, a serious talk with his sister awaited him. The mother stepped closer, and in a calm tone, asked the man to hand over the runaway son to her. She silently rolled up her sleeves. When the father realized the situation, he closed his eyes and surrendered the boy without a fight. The boy dashed away, throwing the burden over his shoulder, and without stopping, begged, "Give him time to explain everything. I defended my ass." His desperate scream echoed with laughter from somewhere far away. While the blonde was quietly celebrating her victory, others tried to calm her down and actually listened to the one who was fleeing. Later, the company gathered for tea, and the guests immediately appreciated the incredible taste of the drink. Even the reserved butler, hearing this, inquired where the boy got such luxurious tea leaves. The little one joyfully praised her brother, and he only smugly squinted. The young man calmly stated that the tea was gathered in the elf settlement, and the elder guest choked in shock. He proudly pointed to the glass jar with the forest treasure, and promised to later tell in detail how he established contact with the tribe. The blonde shouted that the elves had long ago cut themselves off from humans, and the boy only calmly agreed. But the surprises did not end. He dramatically unfolded an unknown shiny fabric before them. The girls froze. They were enchanted by the beauty of the material. The young man proudly named his find silk. For the elves, it was ordinary clothing, but the young man knew perfectly well. In other countries, such fabric would cost a fortune. The elf explained that this luxurious fabric is woven from the threads of a giant butterfly. Placing the bundle on the table, she immediately voiced the main point. Her people are ready for friendship and trade with humans. Those present understood a moment later. The guests from this deal needed two things. A natural question was asked. What exactly do the elves want in return? The conditions turned out to be surprisingly simple. Strong iron tools and peace. Rain smiled modestly, as if reminding everyone, he is only the son of a lord and cannot make alliances. During the family dinner, the boy laid everything out to his family and was about to leave the final word to his father, when suddenly he shuddered. Suddenly his eyes widened in shock. The stern lord immediately broke into a wide smile and joyfully praised his son with all his heart. Ryan openly froze. The father, delighted, grabbed his shoulders and shouted about the historic value of the deal, while the boy nervously tried to calm him down. It was easy to explain such a reaction. The elves had hated humans for centuries, and no one even suspected their neighborhood in the local forest. But now these recluses themselves are offering peace. First-class silk and tasty tea. Looking at this storm of emotions, Rain understood. His father was simply on cloud nine with happiness. A joyful exclamation rang out, as if to say, all efforts were not in vain, and the white wolf Shiro grinned contentedly. The father held Rain tightly in his arms, laughing that even an urgent summons to the capital could not spoil his mood. Someone's hand nervously clenched and wrinkled the fabric of the clothing. The boy and his father sharply turned around. Ellie was standing before them. The girl was hiding behind a giant plush bear and was glancing at them sideways. She puffed out her cheeks in offense and grumbled that Dad was behaving unfairly. Ellie continued to glare at him discontentedly. Rain blinked in confusion. The father returned so secretly that the boy lost the chance to say everything first. The sister's face instantly softened, and she said with a warm smile, "Welcome home, little brother Rain." Ellie joyfully threw herself around his neck. And then Rain, completely calm, said that he had already fought a dragon, and at the same time remembered its giant clawed paw. His legs involuntarily froze in place. Shiro emerged from behind the trees, and the conversation was cut off mid-breath by a brief realization. The boy, just in time, recalled what was truly important. The elves waved happily in farewell, begging Rain to definitely come play again. He had just experienced the most terrible horror of his life, standing right before the jaws of a giant dragon. Even now, the world before the eyes was still floating, as if through fog. Rain froze, barely holding back tears. But at home, he was greeted by the warm smiles of his relatives, as if everything was already behind. But the gentleness did not have time to settle. Instantly, it was torn away by a harsh order to offer the butt, and over the roofs burst a desperate scream. Mother sternly reminded, running away without permission is not allowed. Another prolonged scream burst out from the house. Having received a scolding, Rainford straightened up, smiled sincerely, and solemnly reported about his return. Usually, a happy ending follows here, but for Rain, everything was just beginning. And although usually the story ends here, Rain still had many troubles ahead. At the noisy market, locals were competing to praise the Lord who turned the wasteland into a blooming land. The stalls were bursting with fresh tomatoes and various supplies. The supply finally started working properly. The streets buzzed with the conversations of the crowd and job seekers who were prowling in search of chances. New settlers were massively flocking to the city, joining the lively hustle. Meanwhile, far beyond the walls stretched an endless, quiet forest, undisturbed by any step. What a blessing! The boy was splashing in the lake with pleasure while Ellie and the cat rested on the shore. He swam relaxedly, although he perfectly understood. This body of water had never been here before. The white, fluffy cat lazily sprawled on the grass. The lake appeared by accident. It was a crater from a powerful explosion, when the boy still could not control his magic. Now the pit had filled with water, and he carefreely lay on his back, calling Ellie into the water. He smiled and persuaded her to step in at least up to her ankles. The girl muttered something under her breath, but from the distance he could not make out a single word. The boy asked confusedly. It sounded like something completely nonsensical. Then Ellie blushed, cupped her hands like a megaphone, and shouted at the top of her voice that she simply did not have a swimsuit. He froze confusedly in the water, and suddenly stumbled upon someone's bowls or dishes. A conversation about townspeople who, due to the influx of immigrants, started dumping trash right in the forest, immediately came to mind. Diving deeper, he saw a submerged cart and scattered boxes at the bottom. Surfacing, the boy sighed sadly. The lake had been so crystal clear. On the shore, Ellie greeted him joyfully while he quickly dried his body with magic. Warm light burst from his palms, and the moisture instantly evaporated. He smiled contentedly and began drying his hair. To avoid upsetting his sister with the dirty find, he lied, saying he just decided to rest. Then he calmly asked the girl again what exactly she was shouting to him from afar. Ellie nervously pressed her hands to her chest and admitted that she was very afraid of the local slimes. He thoughtfully lowered his gaze. Underwater, he did not notice a single monster. The boy asked his sister in confusion. A slimy image of a creature flashed in his mind, and he suddenly froze in shock. Ellie shouted in panic. A huge slime had already invisibly stuck to her brother's swim trunks. From the bushes, a semi-transparent drop suddenly jumped onto them, causing the boy to recoil in fright. The creature gently landed on his head. Ellie was not scared at all, and whispered in wonder that the slime was beautiful. Admiration flashed in her eyes. The boy, unhurriedly, looked at the shimmering interior of the beast until his sister relayed to their father the words, saying, "These creatures can dissolve anything." With one sharp movement, he tore the slime off himself and swung it forcefully onto the ground amid the girl's frightened squeal. Ellie rushed to her brother and began asking if he was in pain. Then he nervously laughed and admitted that at first he just wanted to play with them, but he suddenly stopped. He continued to awkwardly poke at his self-confidence, vainly trying to hide the panic trembling. The boy said that a giant white wolf, Shiro, saved him from that mistake, and also recalled a warning from some friend, Ellie. And only now did it occur to him. How does this girl know so well the habits of magical beasts? Nearby, the wolf blinked quietly, and the boy exhaled in confusion. Ellie thoughtfully touched her lips, trying to remember if the mysterious friend had said anything about the place where these monsters come from. The brother rubbed his palm. Instead of acid burns, there was only a slight tingling, and then the girl gave the main clue. Slime appears where there is water. This small detail turned everything upside down. Now they definitely knew where to go next. The boy clenched his fist sharply and eagerly suggested to Ellie to conduct an experiment. But Ellie only asked again in confusion. Since the diet of slimes was unknown, for the test they collected ordinary forest debris, dry leaves, twigs, and pebbles. With childlike delight, the kids threw all this right at the creature's feet. The wood slowly sank, releasing bubbles, one after another. The boy decided to throw in a few more branches and wait. Meanwhile, Ellie got bored and sat down near the bushes. Her attention was completely captured by a random butterfly. Eventually, both of them leaned over the slime again. But suddenly the young man gasped in amazement. He joyfully jumped up and showed his friend how solid objects gradually dissolve in the slime. The girl quickly got tired and fell asleep, and he carefully threw a blanket over her. Settling next to the giant fluffy dog, the boy began to rack his brains. How to properly present the idea to the strict father so that he would allow breeding slimes for the benefit of their lands. He was figuring out how best to present to his father the idea of breeding slimes for their own benefit. Everything depended on the right presentation. His nerves gave out. He sat down on the grass because from now on, everything depended on how accurately he would present this idea. His eyes caught on the slime near the sleeping wolf. Maybe it could be made to work for the good of their lands. The boy strained his brains, trying to connect the slime's ability to dissolve anything with the real pains of the territory. He quietly woke Shiro, ordering him to quietly head home so as not to disturb Ellie. The plan matured, and it was time to immediately go to his father. The long humming from intense thoughts was abruptly interrupted by a sudden insight. Already in the office, the father, together with the assistant, carefully listened to his ecological cleanup project. An open box lay on the table, in which a gelatinous creature was moving. The son hit with facts. Due to the lack of landfills, waste had already begun to be dumped directly into the forest lake. Father thoughtfully rubbed his chin. The idea to solve the garbage crisis, thanks to the unique appetite of slime, really made sense. But the Lord flatly refused to expose the townspeople to danger, especially since his assistant was seeing such a strange kind of monster for the first time. The father grimly recalled how in his youth he exterminated these creatures by the dozens. They do not forgive when vigilance is lost. The boy stared in shock at the Lord. It turned out that the bloodthirsty monsters from his stories did not even remotely resemble this cute pet. Rain carefully dipped his hand into the box. To the touch, the substance turned out to be a unique, soluble slime liquid. Somewhere nearby, a loud exclamation suddenly thundered, and the boy flinched fearfully and jumped up. The man thoughtfully rubbed a drop of slime between his fingers, as if checking it for oddity. He confirmed the nature of the find, but immediately noted the impossible. The creature's body lacked a magical stone, and this already contradicted common sense. After all, any monster or magical beast in this world simply must have such a core. A tense, almost sound-dead silence hung in the air. Rain frowned. He felt that an unknown subspecies had appeared, and at that moment, there was a knock at the door. A timid voice came from the corridor, a request to come in. The owner of the office put aside his affairs, sent the maid for tea, and allowed the guests to enter. A little girl squealed with delight as soon as she recognized the slime secretion in the box. Her companion gently apologized for the intrusion. She just couldn't wait to meet her older brother, Ellie. The little sister rushed at Rain's neck at full speed and happily babbled about the slimy find. The boy could only helplessly resign himself to these suddenly strong embraces. Rain leaned towards Ellie and asked again about the mysterious slime-chan's droppings. The girl looked at him confusedly and froze halfway. She blinked quietly, clutching the tiny slime creature in her palms. At that moment, Ryan was struck like by an electric shock from a sudden guess. He closely examined the lump of slime. It was only a shed fragment, not the monster itself. The boy immediately turned to his father and bluntly stated that his sister was right. He explained that at the bottom of the lake, where he had already swum before, the real, giant body of the creature was hiding. Realizing the danger to the townspeople, Rain demanded to set out on reconnaissance immediately. The man tensely rubbed his chin, trying to comprehend the real scale of the trouble. He sharply raised his head, not hiding his surprise. The boy abruptly stepped forward, burning with impatience and begging to be let go. And then a calm mother's voice cut the conversation into silence. Rain groaned inwardly. Those boring lessons of etiquette and dancing surfaced again. In his second life, he wanted something completely different. Not to chase after slimy creatures. The woman smiled gently and said she had one proposal. The boy looked up in surprise and quietly called his mother. Miriam asked the men evenly if they were not worried about letting Rain go alone, and if they did not want to give him protection. Rain froze emotionally, not expecting such motherly care at all. But the woman just laughed carefreely. She was not afraid for her son at all. She was scared of something else, that the boy would start throwing magic left and right and cause trouble. She explained, sending unprepared people is dangerous, and waiting for mercenary adventurers would take too long. The interlocutor thoughtfully lowered his gaze. He hinted, the ideal candidate for escort is already somewhere nearby, in this room. The man decided it was about the experienced Freed, but Miriam sharply and without hesitation objected. Fried himself, as soon as he heard his name, only turned around in surprise. A wide, confident smile appeared on the woman's lips. She proudly placed her hand on her chest and declared that she would personally go on the journey with her son. A loud scream of surprise almost tore the roof off the manor. All present froze, as if someone had deliberately stunned them. The dense forest stretched all the way to the horizon. Rain and his mother were rushing through the thickets, riding a giant white wolf, and the woman enthusiastically praised his speed. Shiro-chan confidently led his riders forward. The mother cheerfully chirped that the wind rocked and pleased her, while the boy only asked skeptically. Ryan knew the truth perfectly well. The wolf was not running that fast. In fact, he was falling behind because the mother weighed more than him and Ellie. To avoid accidentally revealing too much about the weight, the boy hastily agreed with the words about the incredible caution of the beast. The woman smiled happily, and Rain nervously wiped the cold sweat. He was going to investigate the forest slimes alone, thus ignoring the warnings of his father and the servants. The boy could not even imagine that the mother would actually be hunting him. Her quiet, sly laugh cut off his thoughts mid-sentence. She slyly noted, all the son's thoughts were literally written on his face. Slowly touching her hair, the mother admitted that back in her student years, she had read about the slime that Rain found in the book. This frankly confused the boy. Usually she was not interested in monsters and kept away from such outings. Mysterious words of Frida about her past at the academy suddenly surfaced in his memory, and the girl herself studied magical beasts and once uncovered something truly interesting in the library. There she came across an old book about the mysterious slugs of Aurora. While they were rushing through the forest, riding a giant white dog, the boy couldn't resist asking about the find. The girl sighed dreamily. The legend promised happiness to whoever dared to meet the enraged slug. They say these creatures lived only near the purest springs, with a powerful magical aura. The boy found this cheap mysticism, so he demanded real facts. The dark crowns of the trees flickered rapidly past them, like a shadow wave. She remembered the drawing. These monsters are more dangerous than ordinary ones, and have their own recognizable cry. The boy summed up, and suddenly she revealed another detail. Digestion. She was babbling something about their sweet voice, when suddenly water sparkled ahead. The girl exclaimed excitedly. They had finally arrived at the place. Before them stretched a majestic, transparent lake, enveloped in fresh air and birdsong. A powerful flash of magic flooded the clearing. The mother blazed with delight and recognized the energy, while Rain dryly reminded that she herself had triggered it. But as soon as the light went out, their attention was caught by a gigantic, semi-transparent silhouette. The boy sharply turned at the sound. Right before them, a giant mass was bubbling loudly, and the woman immediately recognized her recent find in it. Rain tensed, finally convinced. Before them was a genuine Aurora slime. He was simply stunned by the scale of this creature. Instead, The mother calmly folded her arms. "Mom, aren't you scared at all?" Rain blurted out nervously. The woman dreamily wished her son to grow up just as big, and this finally threw him off track. The slime swayed heavily and swelled, apparently from the excessive amount of swallowed food. Suddenly, the gelatinous mass effortlessly pulled the discarded old wardrobe towards itself. Silence, and the furniture instantly disappeared into the slime without a trace. The boy's fear sharply washed away with childlike delight. Rain triumphantly clenched his fists and shouted excitedly. Understanding flashed in his eyes. With such processing speed, they would finally solve the garbage problem in their lands. The idea to use slugs for waste disposal turned out to be brilliant. The logistics issue gave him no peace. Suddenly, the wolf tensed and growled dully towards the forest, and the boy froze. A strange noise was heard among the trees. The rustling grew louder and louder. They watched intently the tall grass, in which something invisible was frantically making its way straight to them. It was already very close. The boy almost jumped from fear when his mother suddenly said, completely calmly, she had just remembered one important detail. She carelessly touched her cheek while her son looked at her in complete shock. The woman sighed pleasantly, and from the boy's carefreeness, he immediately broke out in a cold sweat. A giant cloud of predatory killer bees was already advancing from the sky towards them, but the mother only smiled happily. She was sincerely pleased that everything matched the textbook to the smallest detail. In the darkness, the first words of the magical incantation rang out sharply. Shiro rushed forward, becoming a shield instead of his mother, and shouted desperately for her to duck, while she continued to smile carefreely. The woman calmly began to recite a spell, directing fire at the enemies like a punishing net. The giant insects charged in the attack with a deafening buzzing. The boy tensed completely, already ready to bear anything for the sake of his mother. With one smooth sweep of the staff, he unleashed a devastating fiery trap, and the swarm of monsters was engulfed in heat with no chance. Shiro froze from the incredible speed of the magic, and the mother only gently squinted and asked if he wanted to see her cool at least once. She calmly and smoothly lowered her weapon. A warm, not at all battle-like, smile lived on her face. The burning creatures screamed and scattered into pieces. The ground shook from the impact, taking one's breath away. Pill disappeared, revealing the proud and unyielding figure of the mage. The woman raised her staff to the sky, and the space flared with magical energy under the words of a new spell about the primal flame. True hell broke out, and, tearing everything in its path, unleashed a colossal stream of fire. Shiro barely managed to shield his face from the burning heat, shockingly realizing such destructive power simply cannot be unleashed with such a sweet smile. The girl smiled fiercely, and Rain mentally agreed. It's better never to anger such an ally. Her aura promised only pain to enemies. The boy and his fluffy wolf froze in place. In a moment, a devastating blow tore the opponent apart, and he turned into a bloody mess. The threat seemed to have passed, but the girl's face suddenly twisted in horror. Rain did not see this. He was already relaxedly calling the wolf to gather the magical stones. A fiery flash behind him made him sharply turn around. A giant armored insect tore from the air and, leaning its entire mass, crashed into the boy. One monster managed to survive, and it significantly surpassed the others in size. The creature clung with a death grip, and Rain tried to tear it off through clenched teeth. "Rain!" the girl screamed. The boy barely held on under the attack, and already understood. Before him was a special mutant. From the strong compression, the monster's shell cracked dully. The shell cracked under pressure, and the monster let out a strangled whimper. The girl screamed in despair, "Avoid!" And Rain, with his last strength, tried to tear the giant bee off himself. Then suddenly the space around him flared with a dazzling light. A strong impulse pushed the boy along with the monster, far back. Thanks to the slime, he finally broke free from the bee, and he had only one chance to save himself. As soon as Ryan found himself in this strange liquid, he sharply pushed the insect away with his foot and immediately froze. The creature's body began to rapidly disintegrate. The boy was frozen in shock, watching how the unknown substance so quickly corroded the enemy. Panic overwhelmed him. His hand was already numb, and very soon he was to painfully dissolve just like that bee. And in a moment, he blinked in surprise. The expected pain was somehow absent. Rain, inevitably doomed to death, suddenly saw a gigantic shining crystal before him. His leg silently hung in weightlessness. The footwear remained completely intact. A solitary bubble slowly floated upward. Only deep, shimmering silence prevailed around. Heavy drops fell and dully shattered on the dark surface. The boy hung underwater next to the massive crystal and could not understand why it had not dissolved yet, until suddenly a concerned female voice was heard in his head. This surprise confused him. In the darkness, a solitary air bubble slowly rose. It silently floated upward. The young man approached the magical stone, already knowing the voice came from there. The crystal asked if it was heard, and the boy instinctively covered his mouth with his palm. A silent exhale escaped from his lips. He instantly pulled himself together. Understanding that he could respond with thoughts, he barely smiled and directly asked if the slime of Aurora was before him. The crystal softly flashed, as if confirming that name. A completely logical question ripened in the young man's mind. He confusedly poked himself with a finger and asked why then the monster had not digested him. The gaze froze, in the same silent, expectant pause. The crystal brightly flashed with indignation, and the voice emotionally exclaimed that it would never eat him. The boy even lit up, calling the unknown interlocutor his savior. But the voice from the flying crystal puzzledly said they, supposedly, were seeing each other for the first time, and this finally confused the young man. The crystal evenly, without a shadow of doubt, confirmed. Until this day, they really had never crossed paths. But suddenly it stunned with another statement. The young man had saved its life. A memory of a quiet forest lake emerged before his eyes. The boy only furrowed his brows and stared confusedly. He did not understand at all what this conversation was about. Then the crystal admitted it was Aurora slime, an extremely rare mutant hunted by absolutely everyone. From terrifying insects to other slugs, everyone was ready to tear it to pieces. Therefore, every day of his was soaked with sticky fear that did not let go for a moment. From birth itself, he hid under the roots of trees and trembled at any rustle. To avoid giving himself away, he survived by licking only the morning dew. The young man mentally wondered that monsters can also be afraid, but the crystal instantly cut off. It hears every one of his thoughts. The slug got down to the main thing. That day he again cautiously crept through the thickets, until suddenly he was attacked. He was torn apart and cruelly burned, so the mutilated creature had only to lie and wait for the inevitable death. But suddenly, the story was interrupted. A voice from above announced that it was the young man who put an end to these times. At the words, he blinked confusedly. A memory flashed a picture of a colossal explosion that literally tore apart space. In place of the forest remained a giant, smoky crater and the lonely shadow of the boy. Then he slowly turned around, with a calm, innocent look. Only remembering his crime, the hero instantly panicked. The slime told how once he secretly crawled to a fresh pit, and there came across a very young mage. The little monster looked at the crystal, and suddenly he was struck by a sensible guess. The voice from the shining stone enthusiastically reproduced the memory, how the boy with a gentle smile unleashed incredibly pure magic. Streams of water continuously filled the scorched pit, flooding everything to the brim. At that very moment, the boy in wild panic created a lake to quickly cover the traces of the destroyed forest. The slime instantly saw through the deception, and the hero only awkwardly scratched the back of his head. His motives hardly amounted to heroism. The crystal flashed and cut off. The reason is not important, because the youth saved its life. Their connection held as an anomaly. Even rare spirits could not speak to humans in words. The great crystal shimmered in the depths of the water, giving off a mysterious pulse. The boy hovered weightlessly nearby, and hearing a quiet chuckle from there, froze. The voice explained, his magical stone had lingered in the lake too long, in the very one that was soaked with the youth's mana. The crystal suddenly spoke to him and asked for a favor. The boy's eyelids instantly grew heavy, and drowsiness became unbearable. But inside he only rejoiced. Finally, they would be able to communicate freely. Crystal read his thoughts without any difficulty. The voice admitted that it could not leave this place. The separated fragments of the body no longer belonged to it. The entity allowed taking its shards, those capable of dissolving anything, and the boy gladly thanked it. Crystal promised never to harm people, for the lake granted him boundless magic. The boy triumphantly raised his fist. Thus, the city's problem with garbage was forever solved. He sincerely thanked for the generosity once again, but the entity stopped him with one last request. The voice asked the boy to say his name, to forever engrave it on the stone. He modestly replied that his name was not worth any mention. Fingers gently touched the light. Rainford hovered in space before the huge crystal, revealing his name to it for the first time. Warmed by this heat, he sincerely smiled and promised to definitely return. Someone's eye barely opened under the quiet whisper about the future. A dazzling flash tore through the darkness. Rain slowly receded inward, joyfully saying goodbye to the new acquaintance. Silence fell, and then deep sleep followed. The boy blinked confusedly, waking up already in his own bed. In a second, two girls pounced on him with a scream, and then a giant, fluffy dog simply plopped down. Its heavy paw mercilessly flattened the girl's face. Someone barked indignantly at the beast. Rain only sighed resignedly, completely crushed in someone's powerful, muscular embrace. He was held so tightly in the embrace that the poor guy could barely breathe out. A deafening, rattling storm of sounds rang out, as if the room had been turned upside down by an explosion. The father burst through the door at full speed and screamed wildly upon seeing his son conscious. But as soon as the boy managed to come to his senses somewhat, a huge white wolf joyfully lunged at him, almost crushing him with its mass. Cain barely managed to utter a morning greeting. The next moment, the father swept him into a furious embrace, barely holding back from breaking his son's bones. The man sharply pulled away and tensed his muscles so much that the shirt on his chest crackled. The boy blinked in confusion. At the timid reminder of weakness after illness, the father waved it off joyfully, and Cain could only silently marvel at the wild energy of his parents. The man continued to laugh happily, convinced the recent magical outburst of his son was the best proof that he had already recovered. Eventually, peace finally reigned over the family estate. When the commotion subsided, the boy realized he had been lying in bed for a whole 2 days. It turned out that at that time in the forest, he was saved by the wolf Shiro. The beast quickly pulled him out after the deadly bee, and the slime engulfed the boy. Cain tried to tell his relatives about his conversation with the Aurora slime, but this time it ended with nothing. The boy awkwardly tried to attribute his experience to an ordinary dream, but the girl opposite smiled and reminded him he was truly saved. Meanwhile, the adults were already weighing the next steps. They decided to involve the townspeople in collecting the remains of the magical slime. The conversation about the unexpected properties of the monsters was suddenly interrupted by a ringing child's voice. The little sister ran up to the bed in excitement and showed her brother his very own shirt. The fabric shone with new colors, and the men instantly realized the Aurora slime would turn into a unique dye and a new profitable product for their lands. While the young man obediently stayed in bed by the order of his relatives, one of the assistants quickly rushed home to check the new samples. The old saying that Aurora slime brings happiness suddenly turned out to be pure truth. But for the boy himself, the real treasure was this quiet moment. A giant wolf snorts nearby, the sister dozes on the blanket, and the friend calmly peels an apple for him. The idyll was broken by a dull, prolonged roar. The ground shook under the massive steps of giant, scaly beasts that were inevitably advancing forward. From a towering hill, a carefree view opened onto a peaceful coastal town. Two burly strangers, mounted on horned monsters, froze at the edge of a cliff and coldly surveyed the Proudroad family's territory. Two riders on scaly beasts stood still before the endless lake. A dragon's paw stepped heavily on the grass. The mustached warrior admitted that until the last moment, he considered the rumors about this giant body of water a fabrication. His companion silently stared into the water's surface. They had come here precisely to check. He dipped his fingers into the cool current, trying to understand what trick the Proudroad family had pulled. Meanwhile, somewhere in the field, someone called Mr. Rain. The boy in the straw hat turned around in surprise and pressed the basket of fresh tomatoes tighter. The subordinates ran closer and began to beg him to drop this rough work from his shoulders. Let it remain on them. But the young man did not even think of retreating. He was certain this farming routine was the direct path to his dreamed, slow life. No political troubles. At these thoughts, the boy squinted with satisfaction. Rain casually said, "Apparently, thanks to the new dam, the harvests will sharply increase," and asked the servants what had happened. The assistant was confused and silent, while the young man, with a completely serious face, insisted that the rulers simply must personally experience how hard their citizens work. The peasants told Rain that a carriage had already been sent for him. In a moment, a luxurious carriage thundered like a guide, rolling with a shiny chain of wheels. Inside the salon, the young man asked the attendant if something had happened at the estate, since a transport was sent for him. The one-eyed servant involuntarily faltered, as if he did not immediately know what to answer. He hesitantly said that there was one thing worth knowing. "Do we have guests?" Rain immediately guessed correctly. Outside the window, dense forests and cliffs floated impassively. The man nodded. The master insists on the personal presence of the young lord. A nomadic Buryat tribe from the invincible east had come to them, and Rain, only surprisedly asking again, requested an explanation of who they were at all. The servant froze. Could it be that the young man really did not know this formidable name? The young lord playfully stuck out his tongue. No, not the slightest idea. Then the man explained without smiles. These people tolerate no orders and speak with their kingdom only on equal terms. They roam the endless steppes far to the east of the Proud Road territories, and their elite cavalry goes into battle mounted on mighty, armored earth dragons. There were rumors about this tribe. Their combat power was said to be comparable to the army of an entire state. The boy could not help but allowed wonder how they managed to maintain independence right under the nose of such an aggressive empire. The secret was in their invincible core of earth dragons, and now the carriage of these warriors was approaching directly to the estate. Suddenly, behind the glass, two huge, scaly muzzles appeared. The boy, together with the servant, pressed to the window and gazed at the monsters in fascination. The handle clicked, and Rainford entered the hall. A burly man with a mustache stood up to meet him, introducing himself as Basil Buryat, the chieftain of the Eastern Steppes tribe. The boy joyfully ran to his father, instantly drawing the attention of everyone present. The chieftain politely apologized for the sudden visit. Then his son Sergei introduced himself, and the boy thought to himself, the elder guest turned out to be even more muscular than his own father. Basil was silent, piercing the host with a heavy gaze. Rainford nodded reservedly and thanked them for the long journey, welcoming them to his home. The boy took a closer look at Sergei. Against the backdrop of his giant father, the young man looked quite thin, but suddenly he noticed. Rainford, who always remained calm, tensed up like a string. The long-haired host comfortably settled on the sofa and asked what had brought the closed tribe of Buryats to them. The sudden visit of strangers, with whom they had never dealt before, instantly raised the logical tension. The young guest was embarrassed, and he himself perfectly understood that they could be suspected of scouting territories on the eve of an attack. The mustached leader of the nomads did not start beating around the bush. He immediately took the bull by the horns. He looked heavily at the hosts and straightforwardly asked to save his people. The interlocutor froze in confusion, and the little boy nearby stared wide-eyed in surprise. The ruler shrugged. His rural province was too poor to just take and help an entire tribe. The leader sadly recalled how his people had wandered for generations following the seasons in grazing livestock. The young man took the initiative and explained that their whole life revolved around 3 large steppe lakes. And then, like thunder out of a clear sky, all these bodies of water completely dried up without any reason. The host asked skeptically if everything really happened so suddenly. The guest began to incessantly enumerate local wonders, from unexpected iron production to a gigantic lake on the plateau, while the boy next to the ruler nervously gathered drops of sweat, understanding. The culprit of all this chaos is now sitting in the very same room. The nomads reached here only because of incredible rumors. The dead wastelands in the east had somehow turned into a blooming paradise. Swallowing his pride, the chief asked to help the Buryat tribe, with knowledge that returned life to the endless wastelands. The boy cautiously glanced at his older companion. They silently sat on a luxurious sofa opposite 2 men, and a tense, oppressive silence stretched in the room. The mustached leader opposite bowed his head low, respectfully accepting all conditions, not objecting with a word. Suddenly the little one lightly coughed into his fist and asked for permission to speak frankly. The child's gaze instantly became serious. He coldly said that for help, they have the right to demand compensation, and this directly shocked those present. The air was cut by a sharp movement. The feverish subordinate of the leader jumped to his feet and shouted, enraged by the impudence of the little one. His palm slammed loudly on the table. The long-haired man slowly covered the boy with his hand, admitting his son had gone too far, but did not back down. The mustached chief sharply grabbed his subordinate by the hand and ordered Sergei to keep himself under control and not disgrace himself. The boy's father tried to ease the tension, saying the boy just wanted to immediately close all business matters without hidden motives. From the remark that free help in politics scares much more than the demand to pay, Sergei froze. The long-haired one only added that his son sometimes thinks too adultly, so such a shock is quite expected. Sergei confusedly raised his eyes, and it was then that he finally began to understand the rules they were playing by. Renford confidently stated that it was his magical power that became the foundation for the development of the Eastern Wasteland. He looked like a typical caring dad, although the boy only squinted suspiciously in response. The conversation was interrupted by the voice of the tribal chief. He suddenly addressed Sergei. As soon as the mention of magic sounded, the warrior twitched from shock. The tension in the room was so thick that it could be cut with a knife. Coming to his senses, the man hastily apologized for his unrestrained reaction. He explained that the Boreats are a people of warriors, and they have no idea about witchcraft. The boy felt the heavy gaze of the young warrior on him, and wondered mentally if he had dirtied his face with something. The tribal chief immediately got down to business and laid out the terms. 20 heads of cattle, horses, and food supplies, all as generous payment. Sergei raised his hand, stopping him. Their home needed only one specific thing. He flatly refused the livestock, explaining that taking the animals during the drought would be too painful for the tribe. The chief noticeably became nervous, because they had almost nothing else to offer in return. But instead of gold, the boy chose a much more valuable reward: eternal friendship and honest trade between their clans, for future generations. It was about equal exchange and warm relations, which were to be healed and strengthened from generation to generation. The last word hung in the air. A heavy silence fell in the room. Then, the first sound was heard. Someone snorted shortly. The boy confidently laid out his thought. Stable trade would bring much more benefit than rapid resource depletion. But in reality, he simply wanted desperately to see Ellie in a cute, fluffy sweater. The guest was stunned by such iron logic. The boy mentally admitted that half of him was driven by pure selfishness. The mustached man opposite could not hold back and cried with genuine delight. He officially agreed to all the conditions and ordered the matter to be settled immediately. Grayford gladly placed his hand on his son's head. The guest suddenly shuddered, stood up, and shouted across the hall that Grayford had raised an absolutely incredible son. He hurriedly left the estate to deliver the news of the deal to his people as soon as possible. He ordered his companion Sergei to immediately turn back to inform the tribesmen about the agreement. The man triumphantly exclaimed that from now on, the lands of Prudrod are under reliable protection. The guests on scaly beasts turned around and rushed away at full speed, promising to meet again. Everything ended as swiftly as it began, like a real storm. The boy froze in place, and lost in thought, stared into the void. When the companions suggested returning as well, he only briefly agreed. The figures of the horsemen quickly disappeared on the horizon under his watchful gaze. The boy was pierced by cold sweat, from the anticipation that this visit would only open the way to new, big problems. He looked after them one last time. Calm waters and mountain peaks greeted the heroes at the threshold of new adventures. Ahead stretched a wide and unexplored field of land. Rainford held tightly to the white fur of Shiro, sincerely admiring the power of his wolf. Ahead spread the great eastern steppe, endless, without borders. The boy happily squinted at the sun and recalled the recent visit of the Boreat tribe to his lands. He sent the main convoy ahead, and he himself rode horseback to catch up with them and travel without unnecessary troubles. Renford lay on the grass and looked up at the high sky, trying to gather his thoughts before preparing for the task. Shiro happily licked his master right in the face. The wild race clearly pleased him. At first, they really planned to drag it out longer, but the wolf's excitement shifted all the deadlines. Thanks to Shiro's energy, the journey to the village stretched only 3 days. Lord Basil ran out to meet them, and literally showered thanks for Renford's quick arrival. The host led the guests to the settlement, saying that the wagons with supplies had just reached their places. Renford bowed gratefully, because this warm and sincere reception was clearly heartfelt. Seeing the crowd of people, he immediately understood. Everyone here was truly waiting for his arrival as one. Ryan instantly recognized the same Shiro from the estate in the big guy and became seriously worried, since he could have seen his recent antics. Nearby, they were already unloading a heavy cart filled with wooden boxes. The boy showed the mustached man mountains of provisions, explaining that his father had sent them due to the water shortage. The man was stunned by the unexpected sweet taste and could not believe he was holding a vegetable, not a fruit. Rain decisively reached for the next fruit. He said that these tomatoes were the pride of his native lands and advised tasting them plain, without any processing. Glancing over the poor pastures, the young man understood why the locals were used only to milk and roots. Noticing a group of peasants, he kindly called the children to him. The little boy froze in place and looked at the stranger with curiosity. Ryan patiently waited by the cart while people dared to come closer. He greeted warmly and introduced himself. The boy carefully took the fruit and finally took his first bite. His face instantly blossomed with a smile. It was incredibly tasty. He clung tightly to the red tomato, as if it were the most precious treasure. Rain kindly smiled at the chief and asked him to drop all formalities and address him simply by his name. Suddenly, Sergei interrupted the conversation, gloomily asking permission to speak as well. Lord Sergei stepped forward, silently looming over the boy. Rain looked at Lord Sergei in surprise, not understanding where such tension came from. He immediately started with accusations and asked why the boy had left them without the most necessary thing, water. While the chief bowed low and thanked for the food that was supposed to save the people from hunger, the tension only grew and became sharper. Sergei did not back down an inch, fixing his gaze on the teenager and not hiding his irritation. Even full boxes of vegetables could not appease him. Without water, any food seemed worthless to him. He burst out shouting, fiercely demanding to know if they had even heard his words last time. The man still insisted that Rain did not understand the sufferings of their people at all, until the chief grabbed him by the shoulder and demanded he shut up immediately. Sergei struggled, trying to break free, but the leader's heavy hand forced him to stop. Ryan held a pause for a few seconds and spoke in a calm tone to the angry lord. While the opponent boiled with rage, the boy just smiled confidently and said he simply saw no point in carrying water with him. And he stunned everyone with the statement that he could create as much water as they needed with his own hands. The man was stunned, stammered, almost losing his speech from complete confusion. Sergei told Rain directly, the power of one water mage would never be enough to handle the entire settlement. But the boy suddenly interrupted him and pointed to the empty vats. Sergei only briefly confirmed his guess. He sighed heavily, decided that this task was not for a child, and suggested again asking Lord Clayford for help. While he was complaining that there were no supplies, the air around suddenly trembled with moisture. The people below shouted in amazement, and Rain realized, behind Sergei's roughness mask hides genuine care for his tribe. Sergei felt something wrong behind his back and sharply turned around. Ryan quietly and calmly smiled while around him, against all laws, large drops of water rose upwards. What the hell is this? Is this magic? The man exclaimed, not believing his own eyes. The boy stubbornly focused, imagining a stream, the one capable of saving this village. He saw how the heavenly water passed through the thickness of mountain rocks, cleansing to a shine like crystal, a fresh, sparkling stream. A colossal water sphere hovered above the crowd, and Sergei completely lost the gift of speech. The boy was creating the impossible, and did not say a single word of the spell. The boy concentrated and released the power, commanding the magic to fill the jugs to the very brim. The water surged upward with a powerful jerk. A dazzling flash covered everything around for a moment. The stream roared and foamed, as if obedient to his will. The element hit the vessel exactly. He wiped sweat from his face and smiled contentedly, admiring the result of his work. When the boy looked around, he saw only a frozen crowd, standing still in silent silence. Inside, everything cooled down. His heart chilled with panic. Could it be that his thoughts had just escaped aloud, and their emotional explosion was heard by everyone around? One of the girls carefully scooped water from the filled bowl. She froze in place as if rooted to the spot, and the villagers behind only exhaled in shock. The girl blushed deeply, as if warmed from within, and stared intently at the water. Suddenly, the boy had a click in his head. This tribe does not know magic at all, and he had just gone too far. But the girl finally recovered from the shock and joyfully announced to everyone that the water was simply wonderful. She greedily took another gulp and, unable to hold back, screamed with delight because she had never tasted anything more delicious in her life. The men nearby only exchanged surprised glances, as if simultaneously asking her not to be so reckless. The crowd sprang from their places and rushed to the huge jugs with a single shout, "Water!" People froze before the completely filled vessels. Not to mention speaking. They could not even move from shock. Rain smiled gently, sincerely pleased that he was finally able to make everyone happy. The woman carefully gave water to the exhausted old man, softly persuading the grandfather to drink as much as he wanted. Looking at the clear splashes in the air, the boy made a promise to himself to do even more for these people. The chief of the Buryat tribe could not hold back tears. He realized that his people were finally saved. His words of gratitude for saving the tribe sounded to Rain like the highest award. Suddenly, a dazzling pillar of light pierced the clouds and struck the ground right where the young man stood. The first heavy drops fell on the scorching earth, and the chief whispered the name of his savior with hope. The sky finally opened with a blessed downpour, and the happy tribe rushed to celebrate the miracle in unison. Someone quietly called Rain through the veil of rain. Rain stood under the downpour, while below the tribe joyfully celebrated the long-awaited rain. The rain fiercely pelted the ground, but the boy calmly stood under the streams, holding out his palm to the cold water. The girl next to him was beside herself with excitement. She shouted that he was incredible because he managed to tame the water and so easily change the weather. He simply lifted a mass of water into the air, then scattered it with the help of the wind, and real rain appeared. The boy only smiled awkwardly, assuring that he had merely cast a water spell into the sky. She cheerfully tousled his hair while he tried to prove that he had done nothing worthy of attention. While the girl admiringly marveled at his cool magic, the older brother froze and could not believe his own eyes. She kept laughing, admitting that she understood nothing at all, and the boy only nodded in confusion. The brother stood motionless and kept repeating in his mind that such magic simply could not exist. The boy noticed the elder's strange state and quietly called him, but he froze with a stone face, as if he did not hear. He was shaking with rage and confusion. Once the warrior was sure that mages were pathetic weaklings who could not even save from thirst. He remembered his father and sister, and a cry rose in his chest. The boy raised this storm without any spell or prayer. In the elder's head, everything got mixed up, and doubt screamed inside him. Who is he really? And if his ancient truths turned out to be false, then isn't all the warrior's pride worth nothing? Unable to bear the tension, he abruptly sprang up and ran away, leaving the sister and the boy in complete stupor. The woman and the boy froze in surprise, and, without averting their eyes, stared straight into the sky. Right above them stretched a bright rainbow, as if painted directly in the air. The boy even blushed with excitement, shouting out loud, calling everyone to look at the wonder. While the woman worried about Sergei's disappearance, the boy finally understood his anxiety and decided to talk to him properly. Everyone sincerely hoped that this rainbow would become a bridge of reconciliation between the Buryat tribe and the Prodlord family. And suddenly the idol was shattered by a strange, alarming rumble. The sound relentlessly approached, cutting through the silence with heavy steps. From the dust emerged gigantic earth dragons. The boy froze from surprise. The earth trembled. The ground trembled from the stomping of the entire horde of earth dragons. They emerged from the cloud of dust as if split from within. The heroes froze before a living wall of scales and fangs, not believing their own eyes. And then through the rumble pierced a mad realization. A person was riding on one of the monsters. Bartle did not waste a second and launched a frontal attack, hurling curses at the rider. His pupils narrowed. Rage and adrenaline flooded his chest like an electric shock. The stranger only screamed back wildly and angrily, trying to understand who this insolent boy was. Bartle's companion, in despair, called out his name, seeing how dangerously things had escalated. The clatter of steel tore the air to pieces. Blows rained down one after another, without pause or respite. The girl realized with horror. The Empire had indeed begun the offensive. The sky over the plain instantly turned dazzlingly white. A heavy step back, under the enemy's pressure. The gaze froze in extreme tension. Golan pressed increasingly fiercely, forcing Bartle to squeeze out his last strength to avoid breaking down. The grip grew stronger, and the boy had to endure this furious pressure with his last reserves of strength. The angry elder gripped the boy's neck with an iron grasp, feeling that he had caused trouble again. A strong shove made the young man with the axe freeze in place. He blinked confusedly, trying to understand why he was suddenly being scolded so harshly. The girl and the little mage silently watched this stormy reprisal. The old man burst out shouting, calling the boy a fool for attempting to attack the savior of their village. The little one politely stepped forward and introduced himself as Rainford Proudlord, apologizing for the unexpected appearance. The young man froze. He could not make himself believe that this fragile boy was the very great mage everyone talked about. He shrank back in shame, recalling again his father Clayford's order and that strange fog that had just hung in the air. Everyone's attention immediately shifted to the large clay jugs standing behind. But as soon as the villagers saw that they were filled to the brim with fresh water, the boy jumped up in surprise. His face elongated. Genuine, shocking astonishment cut across his features. It finally dawned on him. That magical fog was actually rain that had filled all the village's supplies. The girl laughed loudly, forcibly pressed his head into the vat, and ordered him to stop whining and finally drink. The little mage only calmly watched the commotion caused by his appearance. The giant slurped the treat and burst out with an exclamation of delight. It was too delicious. The crowd rustled. He leaned towards the little one and inquired whether his magic had helped create such a masterpiece. Someone briefly apologized for the recent incident with the water and immediately got down to business. Sergei stood aside, under the scrutiny of a dozen eyes. The tension in the air suddenly vibrated like a string stretched to its limit. The man suddenly burst into loud laughter, contemptuously shouting Sergei's name. He loomed over Sergei and, throwing these words right in his face, declared, "A loser would never be capable of that." The girl could not bear the insult, and fiercely grabbing the impudent man by the chest, clung to him while he continued to humiliate the boy. He mockingly squinted in response and said he had not told a single lie. She gritted her teeth, gasping from powerless rage. He cut coldly. If Sergei could do the same as this skinny boy, he would not have to turn to strangers for help. A self-satisfied smile did not leave his face. He continued to insist on his own correctness. The girl was already beside herself with anger. The outrage was about to spill out. She couldn't hold back and burst into a scream, demanding at least some reaction from her father. Her fist involuntarily clenched. The bitter realization of her own powerlessness hit instantly. The father cut coldly, saying that for the Buryat tribe, strength had always been the only measure of worth. He cited Bartle as an example. Supposedly, he leads the Earth Dragon troops and confidently destroys monsters on the plains. She exclaimed indignantly that it was unfair, but the old man was relentless and bluntly stated that Sergei would never match Bartle in power. While others stayed in the shadows, it was Bartle who held back the entire empire's assault with his protective barriers. Sergei tried to calm his sister and quietly admitted their father's words were pure truth. The boy looked away, feeling completely helpless and useless. Through the pain, she only whispered his name. One thing rang in his head. He had neither Bartle's strength nor Rain's talent for useful magic. The awareness of his own insignificance pressed on him more and more heavily. The father turned around and dryly ordered preparations for the evening celebration. He aspired for the Buryat tribe to accept them, as they should. Sergei began with thanks and immediately apologized to Rain for the boy having to see him in such a miserable state. Rain only looked at him confusedly in response. The man turned and headed to the camp to help with preparations for the celebration. Nearby, Holland would not let go of the girl who demanded freedom, while Rain tried to make sense of this confusion. Sergei guessed. The boy was a powerful mage, as such power was too great to save just one person. One of the warriors clicked his tongue defiantly and irritably. Rain silently watched the bustle unfolding around, not uttering a word. For now, the people began to unsaddle the earth dragons and start preparing drinks. The tribe chief declared that in honor of their savior, they would hold a real feast. The red-haired girl sincerely smiled at Rhine, promising him an unforgettable celebration. She apologized once again for her brother and for what had happened earlier. Rhine waved his hands, assuring that everything was fine, and thanked her for his own salvation. They both froze in awkward silence, truly not understanding each other's words. The girl laughed loudly and explained that he simply misunderstood her. Golan looked intently into his eyes, asking if he really did not need her protection during Bartle's attack. She suddenly became shy and waved her hand guiltily, as if she had just lost her train of thought. The girl apologized for the hasty conclusions, admitting that she had clearly overestimated him. Promising to help with the preparations, she quickly ran away, ignoring his attempts to stop her. He only forced a smile, impressed that she had seen everything. A true warrior from whom nothing can be hidden. Then, during Bartla's attack, the boy really secretly cast the body-strengthening spell on himself. But something was bothering him. While he only dodged, Galan demonstrated a completely different level of physical strength. She laughed cheerfully, as if she did not notice her own strength. Despite her delicate hands, the girl carried huge boxes much more easily than the giant Bartla. He froze, lost in his own thoughts. A strange, incomprehensible feeling settled in the chest, one that had no explanation. The boy looked at the water and tried to figure out what was happening in his head. When a beast emerged from the forest thickets, the boy stood in front of the younger ones and vowed to protect Holin and Bartle at any cost. His gaze burned with cold determination. An old memory flashed through his mind about a promise to become a leader, much stronger than his father. His fists clenched so tightly that they cracked. Back then, he sincerely believed he could forever protect everyone living on the Buryat Plains. A quiet curse dissolved in the cold air just above the horizon. He was left alone with his pain, hunched over at the edge of the hill. 3 friends hid in the bushes and secretly watched the Earth Dragon, hoping they wouldn't be caught in this prank. In a moment, they were already riding the giant, although Goran was afraid until the last moment of another scolding from the adults. Stopping near the haystacks far from the village, the girl confessed. She had brought them here only because she really wanted to see the sunrise together. The dragon confidently walked through the night, so that they could reach the place before the first rays of the sun. Years passed. Now the grown-up girl smiled, remembering those times when their trio was inseparable. The celebration was in full swing, but Rain mentally noted, this warm welcome turned out to be a real trial. She playfully pressed against the boy and asked if he was even listening to her. Rain only averted his gaze in confusion. Looking at the joyful crowd, he felt sincere gratitude. May everyone around finally just enjoy life. Having the mind of an adult in the body of a child, he tried his best to curb the desire to drink alcohol with the others. Loud laughter was heard from Bartle and his squad, and the companion warmly remarked, "Despite the fierce appearance, he has a very good heart." She burst into ringing laughter, and Rain silently observed this happy moment. At least that's how she liked to say it, the companion concluded with a smile. Bartle lost his parents early, and then the chief took him in, and the boy swore to protect Sergei at all costs, the future head of the tribe. But now, everything had turned around, and not a trace remained of that old loyalty. Haran asked if the split really happened at the very moment when Sergei discovered magical abilities. At first, the father was only a little disappointed, because he hoped for his son's persistence, and Bartle still supported his friend at that time. The girl again brought the glass to her lips, admitting her naivety. Time and circumstances mercilessly change people. Unnoticed by herself, the once inseparable trio had gone their separate ways. With bitterness, she reduced the fact to a simple truth. The former world is already destroyed. The main character warned her that she drinks too much, while a drop slowly fell into Haran's cup, echoing her sad thoughts. The chasm between friends grew deeper, as if measured by someone's irreversible hand. Tears ran down her cheeks as she barely whispered about the impossible desire to return that old closeness. A happy memory flashed before the eyes. Sergei, Bartle, and she, smiling, carefree. Suddenly, the night silence was shattered by a desperate cry about an attack of magical beasts that broke right into the heart of the village. Horror froze in Karan's gaze. From the darkness emerged huge wolves, howling madly before the bloody slaughter. A wild wolf lunged into attack, and the boy only managed to shout a call. Run. The warriors instantly blocked the beast's path, shielding the children with their bodies. The air was cut by a swift, barely noticeable movement. Steel whistled as it pierced the enemy. The boy froze, not believing his own eyes. He sharply looked back and realized the girl had vanished from the spot. The next moment, the predator fell to the ground, sliced with a single stroke. The drunken warrior woman was already standing carefree over the prey. In a fraction of a second, she dealt with the enemy. Another deadly strike flashed in the air. While the men fussed, worrying about the little ones, a gigantic magical whirlwind spun up on the battlefield. A powerful tornado swept everything off the path, tearing apart the remains of the wolf pack. A deafening roar announced the end of the battle. When the dust settled, The children joyfully rushed to hug their giant, fluffy protector. The last wolves fled deep into the forest, and the heroes were finally able to breathe out. Rhine rushed away at full speed, whispering thanks to the gods for the mighty Shiro who stayed behind to watch over the others. The adult warriors frowned, meanwhile. They understood that during the last patrol they had missed some of the predators. The commander tried to calm his comrade. If he hadn't killed so many beasts earlier, the disaster would have been much greater. The boy only smiled awkwardly, assuring that all the glory belonged to Shiro's magic, not to him. But just behind their backs, the claws on the paw of the dead beast suddenly twitched. While the elder praised Rhine for saving the children, a distant scream reached the boy's ears, and his heart froze. It turned out that one wolf had survived and was now slowly driving the lonely child into a trap. The air was torn by a desperate child's scream. Magical energy around trembled, like the air just before an explosion of power. The little girl covered her face with her hands in despair. There was no chance to escape from the monster anymore. Rain instantly pulled himself together, gathering all his will into a single gaze. He ordered himself to strengthen his legs with magic, without an attribute, and prepared for a superhuman leap. Ahead was the wounded Haran, and only seconds before the strike, so the boy rushed forward, praying to make it in time. He was rushing at full speed to the wounded Haran, feverishly calculating in his head whether he would make it just in time. A huge beast lunged in attack, but the boy managed at the last moment to become a shield and cover the frightened girl with his body. He tightly closed his eyes, expecting the inevitable deadly blow. But instead of pain, he was suddenly overwhelmed by complete incomprehension. A powerful shove threw the predator away, raising a cloud of dust. Rain appeared as if out of nowhere. With a smile, he extended his hand and asked if they were intact. The boy silently stood on his savior, unable to utter a word. Images of his father and warriors who always had the strength to protect others flashed in his mind. Now Rain stood before him, as if capable of performing miracles with the help of magic. He only quietly apologized and refused to accept help, continuing to sit on the ground. He noticed fear in the girl's eyes and realized that today he was truly incredibly lucky. The feeling of his own worthlessness struck him again, tearing away the veil over the real chasm between them. He became disgusted with himself, for his weakness and for the rage he ultimately unleashed on his loved ones out of despair. He was shown his complete helplessness in the face again and again. All this shame eventually ignited a rage in him, which he sometimes took out on himself, sometimes unleashed on others. He shouted directly in the opponent's face, and asked if he really only desired pity from those around him so strongly. The blonde honestly admitted, the life of a mage in the warrior clan was not easy, and he would never fully understand this pain. At the same time, he assured that there would definitely be people in the world who would see his true essence. A girl from the crowd was closely watching this tense exchange. Rain stood before the round buildings of the settlement and focused on preparing for a new task. The elder entrusted him to investigate the dried-up lake and to look after Sergi, his son. The boys briefly confirmed. They were ready to set out. Rain was already about to leave when his sister called him. She sincerely smiled and promised to prepare the best dinner if her brother did well. Watching them go, Rain felt how Sergi finally shed a heavy burden from his soul. He himself secretly rejoiced. For the rock blasted yesterday in the neighboring village, he did not get anything. It seems this incident became the very real impetus for everyone. Suddenly, a rough voice sounded behind their backs. Someone was carefully eavesdropping on their conversation. The stranger recalled Rain's magical training and sharply grabbed his hand. It was Bartle, and his stern gaze did not bode well. The relatives only hopelessly grabbed their heads. The man had taken up his old ways again. He sneered contemptuously and bluntly called the boy a weakling who would hardly ever master power. Rain did not look away, and in his thoughts made a vow. He would definitely become a mighty warrior. He grinned excitedly in response and said he was eagerly waiting for it. A loud, crazy laugh broke out in pursuit. Sergei called Rain on the road, and the giant wolf only briefly responded with agreement. The boy looked at the girl one last time and finally followed the mentor. Together they climbed to the very top of the cliff. The merciless sky froze over the dead landscape. Rain froze, looking at the gigantic emptiness where once there was a large lake. Sergei gloomily remarked that 2 more bodies of water nearby had evaporated just the same. Instantly, the boy listened in amazement to the story about the mysterious drought. He could not understand at all, how it was even possible to dry out such a mass of water without any reason. The climate in this world had never changed so sharply, so the weather theory was ruled out by itself. Sergei admitted that he was not an expert in such complex matters at all. Suddenly, Rain's gaze caught on a strange black chasm in the middle of the cracked earth. Sergei explained, "This hole leads to a terrible depth, which they still dared not explore." The heroes examined the dry stones, assuming that the main source had once been right here. The man only sadly stated that at this stage, he could not assert anything for sure. The boy glanced over the gigantic gorge and decided, with such a volume, he would cope without problems. The companion froze in shock, not believing his own ears, while the boy calmly explained, "The lake will not fill itself in any way." He confidently straightened up, and magical spheres began to gather in the surrounding air. If the water does not return by itself, it will have to be poured by hand, and for this, it was necessary to hold in mind one clear, detailed image. His old spell for gathering water was too slow. Something truly large-scale was needed here. At that moment, a colossal wall of water collapsed from the sky, and all of it burst out with a loud cry. Niagara Falls. The furious stream crashed into the ground with a roar. The boy cheerfully winked, as if promising, a little later he would deal with 2 other lakes in the same way. The man froze, feverishly wondering if this could even be called simple magic. Both sank helplessly to the ground before the newly born sea. The boy triumphantly held up his fingers. Operation Niagara was a complete success. Shining with pride, he solemnly announced that this venture would be called Operation Niagara. While the lake was filling, the boy thought about how to use these minutes that arrived with the water. He suggested to the mentor to arrange magical training while the water was rising. The man nodded in agreement and decided not to disturb the animals lying nearby. The little dragon and the fluffy cat were peacefully sleeping, as if no conversations existed around them. The young man was fired up with the idea and asked to be shown the entire arsenal of available spells. The roar of the water in the background only intensified the moment and made it truly significant. The mentor took out a magical stone and began to invoke the blessing of pure waters. The boy even jumped up. The anticipation of something grand overwhelmed him immediately. He stared intently at every action, not wanting to miss a single detail. The man shouted the name of the technique and released the small water sphere into the air. But instead of the expected powerful stream, a very meager portion of water helplessly splashed onto the ground. The apprentice was stunned by what he saw, but immediately commanded to move on to the next spell. And the next attempt was no better, just a tiny puddle in the middle of the dry land. The mentor only awkwardly blushed, feeling that very Spanish shame for his powerlessness. Serge blushed deeply and quietly admitted that this spell was the only one he was capable of at all. At such an unexpected confession, his companion froze in confusion on the spot. A long and difficult pause followed. Serge was already on the verge of a hysteric fit because of his own worthlessness, so the other had to almost forcibly calm him down. A sudden flash of awareness made everything around freeze. The hero recalled his own childhood. Magic from the first days was as ordinary a part of life for him as breathing. But the Buryat people lived by completely different, much harsher rules. Serge finally despaired and fell to his knees, calling himself an utterly useless person. Then the boy decisively asked if there were professional ability assessors in the tribe, because he wanted to figure everything out himself. He realized. Serge learned that one magic not out of ambition, but out of despair, for the sake of others, and asked directly how the Buryats generally divide people into classes. When he asked the question about how to distinguish a warrior from a mage, Serge froze in surprise, as if his breath had stopped. It turned out that they had no checks at all. The boy once accidentally copied a text from an old book of his father, and it miraculously worked. Now the last puzzle piece fell into place in the hero's mind, and he prepared to voice his verdict. Recalling Serge's power from yesterday and Golan's might, he finally understood the main mistake of this tribe. The boy froze for a moment, trying to gather his thoughts. He told the man directly that he was a mage, and for the man himself, it sounded like complete nonsense. "You are a mage," the boy firmly repeated, cutting off any doubts with one tone. "Moreover," he added, "the blood of an entire generation of wizards flows in the interlocutor's veins." The man only blinked confusedly, unable to find words and not making a single sound. It was inconceivable to the man how such a thing could even be possible. He recalled his ancestors, Lord Basil, Lord Holon, grandfather and great-grandfather. Could it be that they all hid their true nature? The boy only smiled confidently, as if to say, "He did warn you." The very magical origin was the key to that incredible power he demonstrated. The man exploded with denials, shouting that the Buryat people are proud warriors, not some kind of sorcerers. Then the boy remembered yesterday's rock that he smashed with his fist, and immediately explained, it was all just exercising the body with mana. The evidence was so indisputable that there was no doubt left. Who would have thought that his delicate hands could so easily repel Bartle's powerful attack? He sharply pointed his finger at Lord Holon, as if trying to emphasize, the truth is always nearby. Ryan explained that the chief's lineage unconsciously nourished the body with mana, so they were considered ordinary warriors, not mages. The man assumed that the legendary endurance of his father was magical too, but the boy firmly denied it. Those muscles are real. They sat in the middle of the wasteland, and the warrior, though caught off guard by the praise, was still embarrassed. Sweat was dripping down the man's face as he dared to make an important decision. He was afraid of the title, the strongest in history, but Rain quickly brought him to his senses, reminding him of the promise to Bartle to become stronger. The boy instantly charged with energy and pompously proclaimed the creation of the alliance for the protection of the younger sister. The warrior only sighed. Again he was drawn to those old habits of doubting himself. A short pause followed. Rain slyly winked, asking if he would really give up on the very first day of their union. The man was struck as if by electricity. He even shouted that he would endure any hell in training. And he finally realized, fear of the unknown does not help. It simply hinders his progress. A firm handshake sealed their new agreement. Rain, satisfied with the result, allowed any questions to be asked. He admitted, although he nodded, he still did not understand the main thing. What exactly is this mana without attributes? The teacher and the student froze, facing each other, clasping hands to begin the important training. The order was given to start training from the very basics. The relatives froze at the doorway and could not gather a welcoming phrase. Their confusion appeared suddenly, like thunder. The little one, with a joyful cry, rushed into his brother's arms, just as he finally returned home. But in a moment the hero's strength betrayed him. He simply slid to the ground and croaked that he could not move. Fatigue had broken him. While he lay unconscious, the girl anxiously checked if he was breathing normally, and if everything was all right. She gently smiled through tears and listened as this fool muttered something unintelligible in his sleep. Behind them remained only the ravaged earth. It was cut by deep cracks. Silence reigned over the remnants of the battlefield, and the ravaged earth was slowly enveloped by the calm surface of the newly formed lake. The sky was covered with thick clouds. The boy froze at the edge of the slope and stared down in surprise. He was sure that just yesterday he had personally filled this lake. Together with his companion, he gazed into the void, unable to believe his own eyes. The water level had indeed fallen, noticeably, without any doubt. They concluded that the dried-up soil had simply absorbed all the moisture, like a sponge. But Cersei was not released by the strange black hole that yawned amid the cracked earth. Eventually, he convinced himself that it was just a trick of the imagination and agreed to postpone the investigation. The boy stood up. He straightened his back. Exactly. It was time to move on to special training. Only Sergei's water magic could save the settlement from thirst. In response, he only briefly nodded. They decided to start the lesson by reviewing yesterday's lessons right there on the rock. The air around vibrated as the boy immersed himself in concentration and tried to feel the flows of mana. He closed his eyes and completely cleared his mind of extraneous thoughts. Rain ordered Sergei to activate non-profit magic without any spells, only focusing on physical enhancement. A dim light began to pulse in the darkness. Mana flows swirled around the warrior's feet. The essence was simple. No words, only pure will. Sergei froze in shock, watching his own aura, while the satisfied Rain rejoiced at his student's first success. The warrior instantly realized before him was not just a child, but a true genius with incredible potential. Everything went perfectly, and the man felt such ease in controlling his own power for the first time. The locals believed that magic was impossible without the singing of spells, so even Ryan's mother could not break this rule. But the boy simply did not know about these limitations, so the absence of common sense became his main advantage. While Sergei was trying to pull himself together, Ryan calmly stated that only constant practice decides everything. He explained, Magic requires only one thing: to create the clearest possible image in the mind. It must be repeated again and again until the activation becomes instant, like a reflex during a normal strike. Rain noticed that Sergei's image was already crystal clear, but Sergei himself was drenched in sweat from tension and begged for a break. "Stop! Stop immediately!" the boy shouted in fear when he saw that the warrior was about to explode from overload. Sergei admitted his magic grew purely from personal experience gained on his own, and this is what allowed him to master uncontrollable spells. While they rested, it became clear. The boy's efforts finally bore fruit, especially regarding the volume of mana. Even before the teacher appeared, Sergei worked at the limit of his abilities, honing his powers to help the villagers. He gave himself completely, without any reserves. Now both sat in the middle of the wasteland, completely exhausted after grueling training. And this lasted for whole days, without breaks. Constant work for the benefit of the villagers eventually turned out to be good for Sergei himself. He did it unconsciously. For a long time, he simply followed the call of his heart. Every time the magic touched the limit, his maximum mana reserve increased, and now he noticeably surpassed his previous records. Sergei decisively clapped his hands. Although earlier, he only complained about his own helplessness. He struggled to stand up and grumbled that, supposedly, he had relaxed too much. The break was over, so it was time to try to create a water sphere. They stood opposite each other, focused, ready to move on to the next stage. The boy stretched his hands forward, concentrating all his will on completing the task. Sergei closed his eyes, trying to squeeze out at least a bit of concentration. Smiles of rain flickered in his mind, and sweat treacherously dripped right into his eyes. He put his hands forward, and a dense sphere of magic flared between his palms. Little Al froze, holding his breath and afraid to miss even a moment. A surge, and Sergei, with a wild scream, pushed all the accumulated power into the sky. His face paled from exhaustion, and the little one nearby even trembled. Al literally pressed himself against the rock, feeling an incredible pressure of energy. The boy joyfully exclaimed that today much more water had arrived than yesterday. He enthusiastically supported his friend, not noticing how he suddenly faltered. Sergei's hand dropped helplessly. Watching the turbulent water, he suddenly realized this was the ceiling of his current magical powers. His tired gaze froze on the lake, and in his mind still floated the image of how rain poured mana. With a dull thud, the boy fell onto the rocks, and through a wheeze came an apology for the empty reserve. The friend barely managed to catch the exhausted Sergei, who had completely exhausted his mana. Rain exclaimed excitedly, seeing that since yesterday the water level in the lake had risen incredibly fast. He did not spare warm words and praised Sergei fully. But suddenly Sergei seemed to break down. He went limp and fell to the ground. The mana cut off instantly, so he barely squeezed out a phrase about reaching the limit. The boy firmly stated, with the current reserve, this was really the maximum. He recalled how yesterday rain filled the lake and tried to keep pace, matching that result. Sergei, having fallen onto the stones, apologetically wheezed for his weakness, but Rain cheerfully suggested trying once more. He insisted that the training continue. Despite the students' exhaustion, Rain sincerely rejoiced at such rapid progress. In just one day, his enthusiasm completely captivated Sergei, and he was already dreaming of squeezing even more out of Sergei. Lying powerless, Sergei pleaded for a break. He was completely drained. Rain only smiled gently and asked again what it was all about. He clenched his fist decisively. Leaning over his exhausted comrade, Rain coldly stated that they had just rested. Rain took up the task again, breathing heavily from the tension. He leaned over the drained Sergei, deciding to apply a special method he had observed in the elf village. Yesterday, the boy remembered this technique when he saw his partner exhaust all his magical energy in a matter of moments. A memory flashed before his eyes. The elves collectively transferred their mana to him. Thus began an endless cycle for Sergei: training, complete exhaustion, and painful forced recovery. Although the magic returned, the body could not keep up the pace, and the boy collapsed on the way home. Rain slyly winked and asked, "Is this really the limit of his strength?" He reminded him of their alliance for the protection of younger sisters, and challenged his friend, pulling from his pocket his promise to the teacher to become invincible. Sergei listened silently, lying on the scorching ground. Overcoming fatigue, he began to get up and stubbornly admitted, once again, he allowed himself to be faint-hearted. The boys firmly clasped hands, and Sergei personally demanded to make their training even tougher. Ryan spread into a broad smile, promising his friend an immediate and full injection of mana. Sergei waved his hands in panic, fervently begging for at least a minute of rest. But Rain only loudly encouraged him, at the top of his voice, and forced him not to stop, continuing the fight among the mountain ridges. Weeks Greggy's training flew by in continuous motion, from exhausting rapier duels to endless stacks of papers. And then the day came when the teacher finally admitted he had passed on to the boys everything he himself knew. His young partner only confirmed that Sergei was also giving his all. Basil sincerely thanked the student for his endurance during this long and exhausting preparation. But even despite that, the giant mentally wondered. The boy did not become a mountain of muscles at all, as he had imagined. He scrutinized the pupil's eyes. Sergei met that gaze with a barely noticeable but confident smile. Then Basil finally realized. The boy had changed not outwardly, but deeply inside, and had become almost unrecognizable. Suddenly the silence was broken by Haran's scream. She flew into the hall, calling for her father and brother. Sergei responded briefly to the call. The boy nearby only nodded contentedly, supporting the elevated mood. Everyone turned around in surprise at the noise. The master tried to calm the girl and remind her that they had not yet finished their conversation. Casting one last glance at the apprentice, he already, without hesitation, admitted Sergei had become significantly stronger. The girl froze in place, feeling her heart twitch. A bad premonition cut through the silence. But just as the air had not yet hardened, Sergei appeared, sneering slyly and dryly announcing that the time to fulfill the old promise had come. The rude guest boldly arranged a meeting at the central square, and in response heard a short, firm yes. Afterwards, a oppressive silence fell. Bartle averted his gaze to the side as if he had known about this visit for a long time. The boy, blinking in surprise, said that today the teacher looked completely different than usual. Bartle only confirmed. He was indeed waiting for the opponent, exactly at this time. He wore the formal attire of a Buryat tribe warrior, which was worn only for duels. It looked like a readiness to fight to the end, to stake everything he had. Bartle gently stroked his sister's head, and she, sighing embarrassedly, even blushed. His large palm froze for a moment, as if calming her and dispelling the anxiety. She whispered "brother" in confusion while he stood nearby. A quiet anxiety froze in her eyes, half mixed with hope that stubbornly refused to disappear. The man's gaze became steely. He stubbornly decided to finally put an end to this matter. The sky trembled from a loud cry of exultation. In the middle of the trampled field, the rider froze on his mount, surrounded by hundreds of interested eyes. The crowd instantly erupted in whispers. Could Bartle really have dared such a dangerous duel? One of the participants merely smiled slyly, as if already sensing that a clash was about to happen. Bartle calmly waited, firmly holding the reins of his scaly beast. Finally, Sergei arrived, and Bartle greeted his opponent with a brief, sharp remark. Sergei immediately apologized for the delay. Their dragons were cracking their necks menacingly before the fight. The elder reminded that both warriors were dressed in the traditional costumes of the Buryat tribe, as the ancient custom dictates. He officially announced the ritual of the tribal duel, and asked one last time if anyone among them would withdraw. The man faltered and froze, intently watching the fighters. Both warriors in unison uttered the oath of consent. They would fight to the last breath. In the silent void, the announcement of the duel according to the strict laws of the Buryats sounded. Only weapons were forbidden. The opponents froze facing each other, and each was given the order to fight at the limit of their abilities. The boy on the side, with fear, ran through in his head what was allowed, from eye gouging to deadly chokes. He was shocked because in this circle, everything that is usually called a dirty foul was legal. The tension level soared so high that under these conditions, the fight could easily end with the death of one of them. But suddenly the silence was broken by an exclamation about a single desire. The elder ordered Bartle to voice his will, which exactly he would fulfill if he achieved triumph. A predatory gleam of a smile flashed across the fighter's face. His gaze burned with wild confidence. Bartle pointed a finger at the enemy and loudly declared he would drive him away and lead the clan himself. The witnesses around gaped their mouths. They simply did not know what to say at such audacity. Then he added, if he lost, he would go into exile and forever renounce even the name of his clan. Bartle shifted into a fighting stance, throwing over his shoulder that from now on, the rules were as simple as possible to understand. The leader sighed heavily and involuntarily resigned himself to these conditions. Although everyone tried to hold him back from a reckless step, Sergi sharply interrupted the leader, briefly said that there had been enough talk. Bartle froze while the enemy with a sinister smile demanded an answer, whether he gave consent. The boy rushed forward, ignoring the desperate shout behind him. He only clenched his teeth fiercely. A powerful jerk raised a cloud of dust into the air. The gaze became sharp, focused to the end, aimed, every muscle tensed as if there was nowhere left to retreat. A terrible explosion tore through the air. The wall shattered into pieces. A huge hole gaped in the stone, from which thick smoke poured out. A terrible thought flashed through consciousness. Sergi did not have time to activate the body enhancement magic. A desperate scream tore the silence to pieces. Magic treacherously failed at the most critical moment. Everyone froze, holding their breath inside, and waited for the worst. The little boy panicked and covered his mouth with his palms, not believing his own eyes. The girl screamed, pleadingly calling her older brother. He boldly challenged his opponent to a fight, feeling that he had become significantly stronger. The boy calmly ran his hand over himself, focusing on the enemy. The man and the girl froze in tense, anxious anticipation. Stones from the edge of the cliff began to fall, as if even the earth could not withstand the tension. The aggressor rushed forward with a scream, asking if this was their attempt to apologize for their former spinelessness. He snarled fiercely, but no response, no emotion, escaped from the hero. The attacker continued to mock, confident that the other was simply afraid to seriously accept the fight. Blow after blow rained down on the boy, raising clouds of dust. The relatives were frozen with fear and only watched this execution. The man was already mocking the lack of resistance, but suddenly his confidence turned into wild terror. The dust settled, and before him stood the completely whole and unharmed hero. The boy smiled with satisfaction, seeing the real fruits of exhausting training. He proudly explained his intactness precisely by the fruits of exhausting training. Bartle froze, not understanding how after his devastating attack, the opponent was left without a single scratch. He looked at his hands in confusion, unable to believe in the powerlessness of his own weapon. His massive axe flew straight into the ground, and there turned into a useless piece of iron. While Bartle was regaining consciousness, Sergi calmly walked past him through the breach in the wall. The boy stopped, and his gaze sharpened like a blade. He spoke, and there was not a drop of doubt in his voice. Sergi said directly, "Bartle will not calm down until they meet in a real, deadly fight." "Then hold on, Sergi," the opponent roared, and like a death grip clung to the hilt. Bartle thrust his weapon forward, and openly declared that from now on, he fights with only one intention: to kill. Seeing this, the girl panicked and rushed to the chief, begging to stop the violation of the rules. She was stunned by the answer. If both fighters agree, the law remains a formality. The father coldly clarified that the prohibition was only a principle, which has now lost its force. With a wild scream, Bartle lunged into the air and unleashed all his fury on the unshaken Sergi. One decisive attempt, and he shortened the distance, rushing headlong straight at the impassive opponent. His face twisted into a predatory snarl. His eyes already saw the moment of the finale. A huge blade thundered down, but the boy stopped the strike with his bare hands. While the stunned Bartle tried to comprehend what had just happened, the hero calmly announced his move. He gathered all his strength, preparing to finally show the true result of his painful training. With a sharp, powerful thrust, Niagara drift, and he unleashed a torrent of devastating force on the enemy. Suddenly, the day surfaced in his mind when he, choking in despair, begged not to be given empty hopes as consolation. Then he no longer trusted any advice, and the bitterness from realizing he had no talent seemed unbearable to him. Now Bartle soared into the air, and only his explosive move flared to the extreme. The sun was dipping below the horizon, and in the silence hung the question: could such a fight really hurt so much? The girl scolded Bartle with annoyance for his foolishness. The Trinity froze on the cliff and silently watched as the sunset faded. He turned around and walked away. Finally, without all those regrets of the past. At farewell, it was said that from now on, without any regret, he could move on. Bartle flew down, stunned by the opponent's strength, which seemed to him like real cheating. After the devastating defeat, he helplessly sprawled on the ground, fragments of the weapon scattered in all directions. The blow was final. The judge immediately stopped the match, announcing the finale. The winner was Sergei, and the crowd erupted with incredible excitement. People could not believe their own eyes. He knocked out the formidable Bartle with a single blow. Sergei slowly approached his fallen opponent. He stopped nearby, and without saying a word, stared into the eyes of the defeated. Bartle felt a strange relief. He realized that now their people were completely safe. He croaked and asked if Sergei had come only to mock the loser. The boy quietly called him by name, and Bartle replied that he had always believed in him. The man shuddered when he saw tears rolling down Sergei's face. The memory of a childhood promise pierced his heart. Sergei repented that because of his former weakness, Bartle had to endure so much. Bartle was still trying to joke about the eternal crybaby, but his sister, in tears, clung to him on the cold ground. Goran lashed out at Bartle with reproaches, insisting that the whole village had seen his clumsy attempts to restore his brother's confidence. Bartle shrugged indifferently, lying on the ground, and muttered that he was just doing what he wanted. Just then, the elder approached them. Bartle closed his eyes and calmly admitted his defeat, promising to leave immediately. The chief was about to agree, but someone's desperate cries made everyone shudder. It was Sergei. He stepped forward and firmly declared that he had not yet named his reward for victory. The boy remembered everyone. Mentor Rain, his brother who had always been his goal, and caring Goran. The elder nodded, giving the young man the opportunity to voice his own wish. Sergei clenched the fabric of his clothing in his fist with all his might. He glanced at Bartle, the one who had never abandoned him and continued to support him even in the hardest times. Sergei proclaimed, "From now on, he wants to live on these lands together with them, helping each other." A short pause followed. Bartle listened to these words and clearly realized he became strong only thanks to those who were near. Sergei took the last step and finally spoke what he desired above all else. He only exhaled briefly, and nothing remained unclear. The friend whispered through his teeth that these words came too late. Holding the pain inside became unbearable. He burst into tears, calling his comrade a damn fool. All three embraced tightly, crying out everything that had accumulated over many years. The girl pretended to be angry at these unbearable crybabies, although she herself was barely holding on. Sergei watched from afar, and tears rolled down his face from sincere happiness for his friends. She tightly grasped their clothes, feeling how quickly they would become unreliable without her supervision. The rainbow cut across the sky, as if sewing together their childhood and this long-awaited moment of reconciliation.